Good evening and welcome back. Tonight our road runs north, further north than most stories care to go, into a country of long winters and brief green summers, where the light comes and goes like a tide, and the sea is never more than a walk away. We are going to spend these hours with a people you have almost certainly met before, and yet have probably never quite seen. The Vikings, or rather the Norse, before anyone had thought to call them anything at all. For close to 3 centuries, these northern sailors would move across the world like weather. They would raid and trade and settle, and in time sit crowned in stone halls as kings. Their ships would slide up the frozen rivers of the east and touch the shore of a whole continent that Europe did not yet know was there. And then, as quietly as a fire burning down to embers, their age would end and pass into memory. If you find some comfort in this quiet corner tonight, take a slow moment to like this video and to subscribe if you would like to keep drifting off with stories like this one. It helps this small place grow. And if the thought pleases you, leave your town and your local time in the comments so the other sleepless souls scattered around the world can see that they are not awake alone. But that is all. There is nothing else you need to do now. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears. Let the breath go slow and even, and let the whole weight of the day slide off somewhere behind you, where you will not need it again tonight. You are about to sink gently into the long story of the Viking Age, its rise, its blazing height, and its slow, quiet fall. Just rest and listen. We begin where every one of their journeys began, at the edge of the water. The land we call Scandinavia lies high on the map of Europe, a long shoulder of coast and forest and mountain leaning up toward the top of the world. In the closing decades of the 700s, this was the home of the people later ages would name the Norse. They lived in what we now call Denmark, Norway and Sweden, though those tidy countries did not yet exist. There were only scattered communities, each gathered around its chieftain, each holding tight to whatever thin ribbon of workable ground it had claimed between the mountains and the sea. Norway was a land of deep valleys and steep grey rock, its coastline cut into 1,000 narrow inlets, the fjords where the ocean pushed far inland between walls of stone. Very little of it could be farmed. A family might live on a single shelf of green beside the water, mountains at their backs, the cold sea before their door, and no more room anywhere in sight. Sweden was kinder. A country of great forests and lakes like scattered mirrors, with a long eastern shore looking across the Baltic toward the river mouths of the east. Denmark was lowest and flattest of the three, a land of islands and mild fields and easy harbours, sitting nearest of all to the rest of Europe and to everything Europe owned. And over all of it, ruling everything, were the seasons. Winter arrived early and stayed a very long time. For months the sun would barely lift itself above the horizon, and in the furthest north it did not rise at all, so that people lived inside a deep blue darkness, broken only by firelight and by that strange green shimmer moving across the sky. The cold was not weather in those years. It was a presence in the house. Families crowded into long wooden halls roofed with turf and grass, a single fire burning down the length of the floor, the animals often sheltering under that same roof, breathing their warmth into the dark alongside the people. Then summer turned the world inside out. The sun stayed up almost the whole night through, the fields went green, and there began a frantic scramble to plant and fish and cut hay and gather in everything a family would need to survive the next long darkness. Here is the quiet truth the legends have almost buried. The Norse were farmers, first and last. Long before any of them raised an axe against a monk, they kept cattle and sheep and pigs, coaxed barley and oats out of thin soil, fished the cold water, and hunted seal and whale and reindeer along the ice. Their wealth was measured in livestock and in land. Even their word for cattle sat at the root of their word for wealth, and something of it survives in our own English word, fee. Their iron came not from great mines but from bogs, dug up as reddish lumps and smelted slowly over charcoal. Their year was ruled by the plain, patient, unglamorous work of keeping animals and children alive in conditions that would have broken softer folk. A hard country makes hardy people, and the north was very hard indeed. But there was never enough of it. Good farmland was scarce, scarcest of all in Norway, and as families grew, sons found there was simply no room left for them. You cannot cut a new farm out of a mountainside that has none to give, and so, generation after generation, the young and the restless turned to look at the only road their country offered freely, the sea. The sea was everywhere in northern life, the highway and the hunting ground and the boundary all at once. A people fenced in by rock and snow learn quickly that it is easier to go by water than to fight your way across the land. Boats were not luxuries here. A boat was as ordinary and as necessary as a plough was further south. Every coastal family knew how to handle one, how to read the moods of the water, how to find the way home by the shape of a headland and the slant of the sun. The men of the north grew up with salt in the air and a hull rocking gently under them, and that friendship with the sea would one day carry them further than any other people of their age. For the moment, though, in the last quiet years before the storm, the wider world knew almost nothing about them. To the monks and kings of Christian Europe, the far north was little more than a rumour, a cold blank space at the top of the map where strange pagans were supposed to live. Europe was a patchwork of small kingdoms and great monasteries, still gathering itself up in the long centuries after Rome fell. The most powerful man in the West was the Frankish king Charlemagne, assembling an empire across what is now France and Germany, a man who would one day be crowned emperor in Rome, and who thought of the Norse, when he thought of them at all, as distant heathens of no importance. Meanwhile, the rich monasteries of Britain and Ireland lay open along the coasts, undefended, their gold and silver gathered in quiet houses of prayer set beside the water for the peace of it. No one imagined such places could be reached by an enemy from the sea. No one was watching the northern horizon at all. And the Norse were changing in ways nobody had noticed. Their skill with ships was rising quietly toward a peak no other people of the age would come close to matching. Historians still debate what truly turned them outward, whether it was hunger for land or a warming climate that swelled the harvests and the number of restless suns, or simply the first glitter of foreign silver finding its way north. Whatever it was gathering, out there beyond the last farmhouse, where the water met the sky. None of it had come from nowhere. The people who would burst upon the world in the last years of the 8th century were heirs to a very long past, reaching back centuries before any monastery was ever troubled. Their ancestors had lived in these lands since the great ice withdrew, farming, fishing, learning the water, quietly assembling the skills their descendants would carry halfway across the earth. In the centuries just before the raids, the age scholars call the Vendel period, the peoples of Scandinavia had grown steadily richer and steadily more warlike. They buried their chieftains with fine helmets and good weapons. They sent amber and furs southward along old routes that had once run all the way down to the Empire of Rome. Whatever the horrified monks would later imagine, the north was never truly sealed off. Word of the wealthy south, its silver, its holy houses standing open beside the sea, had been trickling northward for generations along those quiet paths of trade. What changed in the years before the storm broke was that several slow currents arrived at once. The population had grown until the good land could no longer hold all its sons. The shipwrights had reached a skill their grandfathers would not have recognized, so that long ocean crossings became possible almost overnight. And a culture that measured a man by his boldness and his winnings stood waiting for whatever the sea might offer. There was little honour in such a world, in staying home to count the cattle. A people do not become raiders in a single season. The Norse had been gathering the numbers, the ships and the hunger for a very long time. All that was missing was a spark. One crew willing to point a prow south and discover how easy the crossing truly was, and how richly it paid. That discovery was coming. In a few short years, a handful of ships would slip out of the fjords, cross the cold grey water, and come ashore on a small holy island off the coast of England, and the silent north would announce itself in a way nobody who lived through it would ever quite recover from. But we are not there yet, for now the fjords are still, the halls are warm, the fires burning low along the floor, the ships lying quiet on the shingle with the tide creeping up around them. Rest here a little while, in the last calm of a world that did not yet know the word Viking. The place where the age truly begins is a small tidal island off the northeastern coast of England, joined to the mainland by a strip of wet sand that disappears beneath the sea twice a day and rises again as if it had never gone. It was called Lindisfarne, and it was one of the holiest places in all of Britain. A monastery had stood there for more than a century and a half, founded by gentle Irish monks who had come looking for a quiet edge of the world to pray in, and it had become a house of learning. Here the brothers made the great illuminated gospel books, bending over the pages by candlelight, laying down gold leaf and deep blues and greens with a patience difficult now to imagine. Here rested the bones of St. Cuthbert, a beloved holy man whose tomb drew pilgrims from every corner of the land. The island was rich in its modest way, its church holding silver and fine cloth and sacred vessels, and it was completely undefended. Who would ever raise a hand against a house of God at the edge of the world? On a summer morning in the year 793, the monks looked out across the water and saw ships they did not recognize, long and low and impossibly swift, driven by a single square sail and by rows of oars that rose and dipped together in perfect time. On the high curving prows of some of them were carved beasts, watching the shore. At first the brothers watched more with curiosity than fear, for strange traders came sometimes to these coasts. There had been an odd incident a few years earlier in Dorset, when 3 ships beached at Portland and a royal official rode down to greet them and was killed for his trouble. But that was far away and easily forgotten. These were not traders. As the hulls ground up onto the shingle, armed men leapt down into the shallows, dozens of them, carrying axes and swords and round painted shields, and they came up the beach at a run. What followed was over quickly. The raiders poured into the monastery and took whatever could be carried, stripping the altar of its silver, seizing the holy vessels, tearing the jewelled covers from the gospel books, and leaving the pages behind. Monks who stood in their way were cut down. Others were seized and dragged toward the ships to be sold far away as slaves. Some, we are told, were driven into the sea. The attackers did not linger. Within hours they had loaded their plunder and their captives, pushed the ships back into the water, and gone over the horizon as suddenly as they had come, leaving smoke rising from the church and the survivors shaking among their dead. To us, looking back across so many centuries, it was one small raid on one small island. To the people of that time, it was very nearly the end of the world. The news travelled the length of Britain and then across the sea to the court of Charlemagne, and everywhere it arrived it struck the same note of disbelief. A learned English monk named Alcuin, then serving at the Frankish court, wrote letters that survive to this day, and through them you can still hear the shock in a man's voice. Never, he said, had such a terror been seen in Britain, and no one had ever imagined an attack could come out of the open sea. The church of St. Cuthbert lay stripped bare of its ornaments, he wrote, given over as prey to heathens. Part of what made it unbearable was not the violence alone, but the target. In the Christian mind of that age, a monastery was sacred ground, guarded by God himself, the very last place an enemy would dare to touch. That strangers had come out of the water and killed monks at their prayers seemed to turn the natural order upside down. Many concluded it could only be a punishment sent down from heaven for sins nobody could quite name. Historians still argue over something as simple as the date, since the old chronicles disagree, and one respected account places the raid in the depths of January rather than the softness of June. Alcuin himself half believed that explanation, and urged his countrymen to mend their ways before worse arrived. It never occurred to him, or to anyone else, that the truth was far simpler and far less cosmic. The men who came ashore were not instruments of heavenly anger. They were northerners who had worked out that a monastery beside the water was a storehouse of treasure kept by unarmed men who could not fight back, and that a fast ship could carry that treasure away long before help could possibly arrive. For the Norse, Lindisfarne was less a beginning than a revelation. It proved the one thing that changed everything after it. The wealthy lands to the south stood open to anyone bold enough to reach them across water. The silver those first crews carried home, the fine cloth, the price paid for the captives, amounted to more than most of them could have scraped from a lifetime of coaxing barley out of thin soil. And when they came back into their own harbours and set what they had taken down on the floor of the hall for everyone to see, they lit something in every ambitious young man in earshot. Others would want their turn. The word went from fjord to fjord, and so it did. The very next year raiders struck again at the monastery of Jarrow further down the coast, though there they met a stiffer welcome, and some of them did not go home. The year after that they fell on Iona, off the western coast of Scotland, another jewel of the early church, and they came back to Iona again and again over the years that followed, until at last the surviving monks gathered up the relics of their founder and the treasures of their scriptorium and carried them inland for good to a quiet house at Kells in Ireland. Ireland itself, scattered with rich and lonely monasteries, soon felt the same lash. What had looked at first like a single bolt out of an empty sky turned out, season by season, to be only the leading edge of something far larger, a tide that would keep on rising for generations. It is worth pausing to notice how differently this looked from the two shores. To the villages and monks of Britain and Ireland, the raids were catastrophe without warning and without reason, falling on the innocent and the holy. To the raiders, the identical morning was a great adventure, the one road by which a poor man might become rich and win a name that would be spoken with respect around the fire for the rest of his life. Both truths sit inside the same events, and neither cancels the other. It is among the stranger things about this age that the men we remember as sea-wolves thought of themselves as bold fellows seeking their fortune, doing what daring men had always done. We do not know the names of any of them. Not one. There is no record of which fjord those ships came from, no word of what became of the crews afterward. They stepped out of the northern mist, did their terrible work, and went back into it. But they had opened a door, and behind them, waiting in the harbours of Scandinavia, were thousands more, better organised and hungrier still. The 3 centuries had begun, and that small tidal island would never feel entirely safe again. There is a bitter irony in why the holy places were so terribly exposed. The monks had chosen their islands and their windy headlands precisely because such places were cut off, quiet corners apart from the world where a man could pray without interruption. Everything that made them perfect for contemplation made them perfect for plunder. They were isolated, thinly peopled, unguarded, and inside their walls they had gathered the offerings of generations. Gold and silver given to God by kings and nobles, hoping to buy the safety of their souls. To a raider, such a house was a treasury with the doors standing open and nobody at all inside to close them, nor did any strong hand rise to shield them. The kingdoms of Britain were divided, their rulers absorbed in their own quarrels. The coastline was long, the ships came without warning, and by the time any lord had gathered his men, the raiders were already small shapes far out on the water. The monks could do little but pray, set the horror down in trembling ink, and at last, when the raids grew too frequent to bear, abandon their houses altogether and carry the bones of their saints inland. Slowly, a shadow settled over every coast within reach of a northern keel, a dread of the unfamiliar sail on the horizon that would hang over Christendom for the better part of 300 years. Rest now, and carry with you the picture of those low hulls sliding up onto wet sand in the grey light of a summer dawn. Before we follow the raids as they spread, it is worth spending a quiet while with the people themselves, because nearly everything you may picture when you hear the word Viking is at least a little wrong. Begin with the helmet. The snarling warrior crowned with 2 great curling horns is one of the most stubborn falsehoods in all of history. No Norseman ever wore such a thing. Horns would be worse than useless in a fight, a convenient handle for an enemy, a snag waiting to catch, and not one horned helmet has ever come out of a Viking grave. The image belongs instead to a costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler, dressing singers for a German opera in the 1870s, who wanted his heathens to look wild and ancient. The picture was so striking that it fastened itself to the real Norseman and has never let go. A small thing, perhaps, but it tells you how much of what we think we know was invented long after the last of them was gone. So set the horns aside. The word Viking itself is a good place to start over. In the Old Norse tongue, it was hardly the name of a people at all. To go Viking meant to take a ship out in search of plunder or trade. It was an activity, a season's work, something a man did rather than something he was. Historians still argue about where the word came from, whether from the bay they called the Vik, or from an older term for a creek or inlet, or from the shift a man rowed at the oar. What is certain is that the great majority of Scandinavians never went Viking at all. They stayed home their whole lives, farming, fishing, raising children. Most of them would have thought the raiders a small and reckless minority, best kept at arm's length. When we call an entire civilization the Vikings, we are naming a whole people after the most dramatic thing a few of them ever did, rather as if a modern country were known forever by the names of its sailors and soldiers alone. Nor were they one people with one king and one purpose. They were spread across Denmark, Norway and Sweden in countless small communities, and they quarrelled among themselves at least as often as they troubled anyone abroad. A man's loyalty ran to his family, to his local chieftain, and to his own good name, and not to any grand notion of a Viking nation, which never existed at all. When they went out into the world, they went in small, independent bands, each following its own leader for its own gain. This is a large part of why they proved so impossible to stop. There was no single head to strike off, no capital to besiege, no king who could be defeated and made to call the whole thing to a halt. There were only more ships and more restless men, arriving season after season from 100 separate harbours. In their daily lives, as we have seen, they were mostly farmers. They were also, to the considerable surprise of the peoples they met, remarkably clean. Archaeologists digging through Norse settlements keep finding combs, more combs than almost anything else, along with tweezers and razors and little implements for cleaning under the nails and inside the ears. They bathed regularly, and in a world where most people did not, this made an impression. There survives a marvellously sour complaint from an English churchman, grumbling that the Danish men of his town were stealing away the local women by the unfair advantage of combing their hair every day, bathing every Saturday, and changing their clothes rather more often than seemed necessary. To this day, the word for Saturday in the Scandinavian languages descends from their old word for washing day. It is a strange thought that men so feared for their savagery were, by the standards of their time, unusually well groomed. The warriors have gathered their own crop of legends, and here too the truth is more interesting than the myth. There really were fighters called berserkers, men who worked themselves into a wild battle fury, howling, biting the rims of their shields, said to feel neither pain nor fear once the frenzy had them. Our own word berserk comes down from them. Whether that rage was ritual or discipline or some plant or drink, or simply a terrifying kind of self-hypnosis, nobody can now say. What is clear is that ordinary Norse warfare was nothing like a mob of madmen. Men fought shoulder to shoulder in a wall of overlapping shields, each covering the man beside him, advancing as one body. It takes nerve and training and a great deal of trust to hold a line like that, and they were very good at it. They were also, and this is easy to forget beneath the noise of the raids, extraordinary makers of things. Their craftsmen worked iron and silver and gold with real delicacy, covering everything from sword hilts to cloak brooches, with intricate patterns of gripping beasts, whose bodies twisted and knotted into one another, until you cannot tell where one creature ends. They carved wood beautifully, on their ships, their houses, their sledges. They composed poetry of dizzying complexity, prizing wordplay and buried meaning so highly that a fine poet was honoured almost as much as a fine warrior. Their whole society ran on spoken law, memorised and handed down, and a man who could shape words well held genuine power. The raider with the axe and the poet with the memory were very often the same person. Holding all of it together was a fierce sense of personal honour. In a world where almost nobody wrote anything down, a man truly was only as good as his name and the things said about him. To be thought a coward was worse than dying. To be generous, brave, loyal and clever with words was to be rich, whatever the state of your fields. This is why the sagas, those great prose tales set down in later centuries, circle endlessly around insult and revenge and reputation. It was the real currency of their lives, and it explains a good deal about the raids. The young man who came home heavy with silver and with stories had won something worth more than the silver. He had won a name. Keep this fuller picture as we go on, because the story only makes sense once you see them whole. Farmers and poets and craftsmen and traders as much as raiders. Clean, proud, law-minded, bound together not by any nation but by family and honour and their long marriage to the water. And there was far more to their lives than work and war. Through the long dark of winter, they gathered in the halls to feast and drink and test one another at games. They played a board game in which a king and his defenders struggled to break out through a ring of attackers, a contest of wits that a clever man prized winning almost as much as a wrestling bout. And wrestle they did, along with swimming and rowing and skating out on the frozen lakes on blades cut from the leg bones of horses. Bodily strength was admired, and a man liked to show it. They delighted in riddles and in the trading of verses, and a guest who could answer a hard riddle or cap a clever line earned real respect around the fire. There is a lively argument, too, about the place of women in this warlike world. The old tales speak of shield maidens, women who took up arms and fought beside the men. A famous chamber grave at Birka in Sweden, long assumed to belong to a male warrior because of the weapons and the 2 horses laid in it, was found on closer study of the bones themselves to hold a woman. Whether such women truly fought, or were revered figures buried with the symbols of a warrior family, scholars still cannot agree. What is beyond doubt is that the women of the north were nobody's meek shadows. They come down to us in the sagas as proud, sharp-tongued, formidable personalities, and very often as the ones who drove the men into the feuds they died in. Rest now, and let the snarling cartoon fade, and see instead the real men and women of the north as they actually were. And then let us turn to the thing that made all of it possible. It was not a sword, it was not a king, it was a boat. The Norse longship stands among the great inventions of the early medieval world, and without it none of what follows could have happened at all. It was the tool that turned a scattering of northern farmers into a force able to strike anywhere from the coast of Ireland to the rivers of Russia. To understand these people, you have to understand their ships, and to understand their ships is to admire them, because they were genuinely beautiful and centuries ahead of anything their victims could put on the water. The heart of the longship's genius was that it did 2 things at once that no other vessel of the age could manage together. It could cross open ocean, riding out heavy weather far from any land. It could also glide up a shallow river, or run straight onto a flat beach where there was no harbour at all. Most ships could do one or the other. This one did both, and that single fact is what made the Norse so nearly impossible to defend against. Guard the coast, and they came up an inland river. Fortify the river mouths, and they landed on an open shore. They could appear almost anywhere there was water enough to float a hull that drew barely more than the depth of a man's knee. The secret lay in how it was built. The Norse used a method we now call clinker construction, in which the hull was made of long overlapping planks, each riveted to the one below, forming a shell that was light and strong and, above all, flexible. Instead of a heavy, rigid frame, the ship had a supple skin that could give and work with the movement of the sea, so that it rode over the waves rather than fighting them. Down the centre ran a single great keel carved from one long timber, the backbone that let the vessel hold a course under sail. The whole thing was light enough that a crew could haul it up a beach, or even carry it short distances overland from one river to the next, and yet seaworthy enough that men crossed hundreds of miles of open water in it, out of sight of anything at all. Power came from two sources, and they could change between them as they pleased. When the wind was fair, they raised a single large square sail, often woven of wool and dyed in bold stripes, and let the weather carry them at something close to the pace of a galloping horse. That sail was no small thing. A large one might swallow the wool of hundreds of sheep and years of patient spinning and weaving, most of it done by the women of the farm, so that in a real sense a ship could not sail without them. When the wind died, or when the crew wanted to slip quietly up a river, or to turn sharply in a fight, the sail came down and the oars ran out, and the ship went forward on the strength of men's arms alone. A large longship might carry 60 men or more, every one of whom could pull an oar and swing a blade, so that the vessel was crew and transport and army all at once. There was no separate class of sailors and soldiers. Every man aboard was both. Not all their ships were warships. The Norse built a whole family of vessels, each shaped to its purpose. For raiding, they built the long, slender, hungry-looking craft we usually picture, packed with fighting men. But for trade, for hauling goods and settlers across the sea, they built something broader and deeper and sturdier, called the gnar, which gave up speed in exchange for room, and could carry cattle and timber and grain and whole families to distant new homes. It was the humble gnar, far more than the glamorous warship, that took the Norse to Iceland and Greenland and beyond, and that moved the great tides of goods on which their real wealth rested. The raiders won the fame. The traders in their fat little cargo ships did much of the lasting work. Steering any of it across trackless water without compass or chart called for a seamanship that seems close to magic now. The Norse navigators read the world around them like a page. They watched the sun by day and the stars by night, judged how far north they had come by how high the noon sun climbed, noted the run of the prevailing wind and the shape of the swell beneath the hull. They followed seabirds, which turned toward land at evening. They watched for the pale greenish cast that clouds take on when they pass over ice or shallow water. Some accounts speak of a sunstone, a crystal that could find the hidden sun through fog and cloud, and scholars still argue over precisely how or whether it worked. Above all, they carried in their heads an immense inherited memory of coastlines and currents and landmarks, handed down from older sailors, so that an experienced captain could cross the northern sea by signs a stranger would never have noticed at all. They loved these ships past all usefulness. They gave them names. They set carved animal heads on the prows to frighten enemies and whatever else might be watching. They cared for them the way you care for something living. And when a great chieftain or a wealthy woman died, the highest honour of all was sometimes to be buried inside one, laid down in the hull with weapons and treasure and provisions for the road into the next world. It is from a handful of these ship burials, preserved by pure chance in wet clay, that we know as much as we do about how the vessels were built, because the timbers survived where everything else quietly rotted away. A few have come back to us almost whole. Out of the blue clay of Norway, diggers have lifted ships buried more than 1,000 years ago as the tombs of great persons, their oak kept sound by the airless mud. One of them, carved from stem to stern with running patterns of beasts, had served as the resting place of a woman of the very highest rank, sent into the dark with a wealth of goods around her. Another, longer and plainer and stronger, showed exactly how a true ocean-going vessel of that century was made. So picture the fleet leaving the fjord in the early light, sails filling with the northern wind, oars lying ready for the moment it drops, prows carved into dragons and serpents, each hull carrying its crew of farmer warriors out toward whatever the sea decides to give them. Everything that comes after, the raids and the settlements, the trade and the kingdoms, all of it rides on the water in these slender wooden shells. Stand in front of one of those recovered hulls today, and you can follow every overlapping plank with your eye. Count the rivets one by one, and begin to feel the patience folded into it. A longship was a costly and demanding thing to make. It swallowed whole stands of good straight timber, dozens of tall oaks felled and split by hand. It required thousands of rivets, each forged singly at a fire. It needed that vast sail, months and years of spinning and weaving, and it needed master shipwrights whose knowledge had been won across a lifetime and handed down from father to son, men who could judge the curve of a plank by feel. And for all their grace, these vessels were dangerous. The northern sea is cruel, and it does not forgive. Many a crew that pushed off in high spirits was simply never seen again, taken by weather far from any shore, leaving a family on some green shelf of land to watch the water for a sail that would not come. The Norse understood this perfectly. They went anyway. The sea was their road to fortune and, often enough, their grave. Rest now, and let the rhythm of the oars carry you a while. Dip and pull, dip and pull, out across the dark, calm water toward what comes next. While the raiders were away winning silver, life in the north went on in its old, slow rhythm, and it is worth stepping ashore to see how that life was ordered, because the shape of it explains almost everything else. Their world was built around the farm and the family, and divided quite openly into ranks. At the top stood the jarls, the nobles and great chieftains, men of broad lands who owned ships and led others in war and peace. A jarl kept a hall full of followers, rewarded them with feasting and arm rings of silver, and expected in return their loyalty and their weapons. These were the men whose names filled the poems, who could raise a fleet when they chose, and whose private quarrels could unsettle a whole region. Beneath them, and forming the true backbone of everything, were the carls, the free farmers, and it was among these that most Norse people lived and died. A carl owned his own land, however little of it, kept his own animals, carried his own weapons, and had a voice in the assembly of his district. He was nobody's servant. He could speak his mind in public, marry as he liked, and pass his farm to his children. This broad class of proud, self-reliant landholders gave the North much of its stubborn character. For a free man, there answered to no lord as a peasant further south answered to his. Below the carls lay a third rank, and the picture is not honest without it. The thralls, the slaves. Slavery ran deep through Norse life. Thralls did the hardest and filthiest work on the farms and held almost no rights at all, counted as property to be bought and sold and given away. Many of them were captives taken in the very raids we have been following, dragged out of monasteries and coastal villages across the Christian lands, which is a sober reminder of what those adventures meant to the people on the receiving end. A great part of the wealth gathered in that age was measured not in silver but in human beings, and some historians now argue that the slave trade, not plunder, was the true engine of the whole enterprise. The texture of daily life differed sharply between these ranks, and yet certain things were shared by everyone. People lived in long houses of timber or turf, built around a central hearth where the fire burned day and night for warmth and light and cooking, the smoke drifting up and out through a hole in the roof. In the long dark of winter, the family gathered close in that smoky warmth. The wealthier the household, the longer and finer the hall, and the more followers it could feed. The food was hearty and plain, fish and meat, beef and mutton and pork, and whatever the hunt brought home, with bread and porridge of barley and oats, cheese, butter and skyr, the thick, soured milk still eaten in Iceland today. They boiled and roasted and preserved what was left by smoking and drying and salting against the lean months. They drank ale brewed from barley, and the rich drank mead made from honey, and at a feast the horns went round the fire long into the night. Clothing marked the ranks too, within a common style. Most garments were wool and linen, spun and woven and sewn at home by the women of the household, slow and unending work. A free man wore a woolen tunic belted over trousers, a cloak pinned at the shoulder with a brooch, shoes of leather. A woman wore a long linen underdress beneath a woolen overdress held up by a pair of oval brooches at the shoulders, and from those brooches she often hung small, useful things on chains, scissors, little tools, and keys. The keys especially were worn with pride, the plain sign that she was mistress of the household stores. The wealthy set themselves apart with brighter dyes, with imported silk and fine trim, with silver and gold at the wrist and throat. A thrall made do with the coarsest cloth there was, and colour was prized by anyone who could afford it, reds and blues and greens drawn from plants and minerals. So the notion that these were a people dressed all in drab brown is one more mistake. A prosperous hall on a feast night would have been full of colour and gleaming metal. Presiding over the affairs of free men was a remarkable institution called the Thing, an open-air assembly where the free men of a district met at fixed times to make law, settle quarrels, and decide whatever mattered to them all. In most of the Norse world, there was no king handing down commands from above, and no written code at all. Instead, the law lived inside the memory of one chosen man, the law speaker, who had learned the whole body of custom by heart and recited portions of it aloud at each gathering so that no one could claim not to know it. Disputes were argued in the open before the assembled men, and judgment was reached together. It was rough justice, and a man who felt wronged might still settle matters with his own hand. But the Thing gave ordinary farmers a genuine share in governing themselves, something almost unheard of anywhere else in that century, and its descendants sit in the parliaments of Scandinavia still. Women held a stronger position here than in many neighbouring societies, though it was nothing like equal. A free woman could own property, inherit land, and seek a divorce if her husband mistreated her or failed to provide for her. And when the men were away for months at a time on the water, it was into her hands that everything fell. It was the wife who ran the farm and everyone on it, the stores, the animals, the work and the workers, sometimes for half a year at a stretch. That bunch of keys hanging at her belt was no ornament. It was a badge of real authority. Women could not speak at the Thing nor hold office there. Yet inside the household, and in every matter touching family honour, their influence was solid and acknowledged, and some rose to considerable prominence as wealthy landholders in their own right. Stretched over all of this life was the old religion, a rich tangle of gods and spirits and fate. The Norse worshipped many, and three stood above the rest. Odin, one-eyed, god of wisdom and war and poetry and magic, who had traded his own eye for knowledge, and who gathered the slain into his hall. Thor, red-bearded, god of thunder, strong and blunt and dependable, who swung his hammer against the giants, and was the particular friend of farmers and sailors, the god ordinary people actually prayed to. And Freya, goddess of love and fertility and abundance, who was also, tellingly, bound up with war and the choosing of the dead. Around these great figures swarmed a host of lesser beings, giants and elves and dwarves, living just beneath the surface of the visible world. And beneath all of it ran the iron thread of fate. A man's destiny was already woven and could not be undone, so that the only thing genuinely within his power was how bravely he met it. That single belief, that death arrives when it arrives and courage is all you truly own, sat near the very centre of who these people were, and it followed them onto every beach they ever stormed. Their religious life was not only a question of which names they called on, but a whole calendar of ritual wound through the turning year. The great festivals fell at the hinges of the seasons, and the mightiest was the midwinter feast of Yule, kept in the deepest dark, when the whole community gathered to eat and drink and make offerings in the hope that the sun would climb back and the light would lengthen. At such gatherings they held sacrifices called blot, in which animals were offered to the gods and the blood sprinkled about to bless the hall and everyone sitting in it, after which the meat was cooked and shared out, so that worship and celebration were the same act. Stranger figures moved alongside the ordinary keepers of this faith. There were wandering women credited with the gift of prophecy, received with honour, seated on a high platform above the company, who would sink into a trance and speak of what the coming season held for the harvest and the people. And there were the skalds, court poets of real standing, who composed intricate verses in praise of kings and heroes, and kept alive in memory the deeds that would otherwise have gone silent. Over everything lay a particular vision of what waits afterward, in which the slain might be carried to a great hall to feast and fight until the ending of the world, while others went down to a quieter, colder country below. It was a faith built less for comfort than for courage, matched exactly to the hard land that shaped it. Though it is worth saying that almost everything we know of these beliefs was written down centuries later by Christian scholars, and historians still debate how much of that tidy pantheon the living Norse would have recognized. Rest now, warm beside the imagined hearth, and let the ordered world of the farm and the hall settle quietly around you. For the first 40 years or so after Lindisfarne, the raids kept to a familiar shape. Small bands of ships set out in spring, crossed to the coasts of Britain or Ireland or the Frankish lands, struck at something rich and undefended, and sailed home before winter with plunder and captives. It was seasonal work, fitted neatly around the farming year, like the harvest. A man went Viking in the warm months when the sea allowed it, and came back to his fields when the weather turned. But as the decades went by, the pattern changed, and the change made them far more dangerous. The first shift was simply scale and nerve. What had begun as raids on lonely island monasteries grew into attacks on towns, on trading centres, at last on whole regions. The great Frankish port of Dorestad, one of the richest markets in northern Europe, was plundered again and again until it simply withered off the map. Fleets grew from a handful of ships to dozens, then to hundreds. The raiders learned the geography of their targets, which rivers led to which wealthy inland towns, when the fairs were held and the treasuries full, where resistance was thin. They began rowing their shallow hulls far up the great rivers of the continent, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, striking deep into places that had assumed themselves safe simply because they lay far from the sea. It turned out that no river town was beyond reach. Ireland felt this pressure early and heavily. The island was scattered with monasteries that were storehouses of learning and wealth, and divided politically among many small quarrelling kingdoms that could rarely combine against anyone. The Norse struck those religious houses relentlessly, and then took a fateful further step. Instead of always sailing home, they began building fortified camps at river mouths and sheltered harbours where they could sit out the winter and raid again the moment spring came, without the long voyage back and forth. One such camp, planted on the river Liffey, grew into a settlement and then into a town. They called it by a name meaning the Black Pool, and it would become Dublin. Several of Ireland's great cities, Waterford and Wexford and Limerick and Cork among them, began their lives as Norse bases. The sea wolves were putting down roots. That habit of wintering over was the second great change, and it altered everything. Once a Norse army could stay in a foreign country all year, it was no longer a raid that came and went like a summer storm. It was an occupation. The men could rest, repair the ships, gather supplies, take local wives, and be ready to campaign far earlier and far longer than any defender expected. A kingdom might survive a raid of a few weeks. An army that settled in and simply declined to leave was a different order of problem altogether. And more, they came not merely to rob, but to be paid. They offered to go away, or at least to stop burning, in exchange for great weights of silver, payments remembered afterward by a grim name, meaning Dane money. It taught them something dangerous. A frightened kingdom would often hand over more treasure to be left alone than they could ever have taken by force, which of course only guaranteed that they would come back and ask a second time. The Frankish Empire, which under Charlemagne had looked so formidable, turned out to be especially fragile once the great man was gone. His realm was divided among quarrelling heirs and grandsons, and an empire at war with itself cannot organise a steady defence of long coasts and longer rivers. The Norse read that weakness exactly and used it without mercy, rowing upstream to sack one town after another. A united empire might have swept them off its waterways within a season. A divided one could only pay and pray and endure. The pressure on the Franks reached its height when an enormous fleet came up the Seine and laid siege to Paris, in those days a fortified town crowded onto an island in the river. For most of a year the Norse threw themselves at the bridges and the walls, while the defenders held on through hunger and assault under a count named Odo, who made his reputation there and would one day be king. Paris did not fall. But the siege showed how far the raids had travelled from their beginnings, from lightning strikes on empty beaches into full campaigns of siege warfare against the greatest cities of the West. And in the end, the Frankish king, unable to break them, paid the besiegers a great weight of silver and let them sail on to plunder somebody else, a settlement that satisfied nobody and taught the Norse once again that patience is rewarded. Some ventures carried them astonishingly far afield. One bold fleet, led by chieftains whose names the sagas kept for centuries, sailed clean out of the northern seas, down past the coasts of Spain, through the narrow straits and into the Mediterranean itself, raiding along the shores of North Africa and up into Italy. There is a famous story that this fleet, hungry for the greatest prize imaginable, mistook a handsome Italian town for Rome and took it by an elaborate ruse, only to discover afterward that they had sacked entirely the wrong city. Whether or not every detail is true, it catches the sheer reach of these voyages, which by now stretched across the whole Western world, from the cold north to the warm blue south. Britain, meanwhile, was not one country, but several. The land was parcelled among a handful of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, Mercia across the middle, East Anglia to the east, and Wessex in the south, with the Welsh and the Scots and others beyond them. These kingdoms competed and fought and schemed against one another, and like the Irish, they found it almost impossible to present a common front. Through the middle of the 9th century, the raids on Britain grew heavier and more frequent, and here too the Norse began to overwinter, planting themselves on islands and in coastal camps, and declining to leave. A people who had once suffered a raid and then breathed out again when the ships had gone, now faced an enemy who came and stayed and grew stronger every year. By the middle of that century, the whole character of the thing had changed. These were no longer summer raiders snatching what they could carry. They were becoming settlers and conquerors, builders of towns, collectors of tribute, founders of a permanent presence in lands they had once merely robbed. The scattered sparks of the early years were drawing together into a steady fire, and the greatest test of all was about to come ashore in England. In the year 865, something arrived on the English coast that the country had never faced. Not a raiding party of a few ships, not even a large fleet come to plunder and go home. It was an army, a great combined host, drawn from across the Norse world, and it came with a purpose far larger than treasure. The English who lived through it called it, with dread, the Great Heathen Army. It did not intend to raid England, it intended to take it. The host landed first in East Anglia, and then, rather than attacking at once, did something quietly shrewd. It made a kind of peace with the local people, wintered there in comfort, and used the season to gather horses, so that a force which had arrived by sea could suddenly move overland at the speed of cavalry. Rested and mounted, the army then struck north with great violence toward Northumbria and its chief city, York. Northumbria, as luck would have it for the invaders, was in the middle of a civil war, its people split between two rival claimants to the throne. The Norse fell on this divided kingdom and took York, and when the two Northumbrian rivals at last patched up their quarrel and combined to retake the place, both of them were killed and their armies broken apart. One of the four great kingdoms of England had fallen in a single stroke, and the Northerners set up a puppet ruler to hold it for them. Behind the army, according to the later sagas and chronicles, stood the sons of a half-legendary sea king named Ragnar Lothbrok, and chief among them a leader remembered as Ivar, called the Boneless, a nickname that has puzzled everyone ever since. Whether it pointed to some condition of the body, to an unusual suppleness, to a lack of children, or to something else entirely, nobody can now say. And Ivar himself sits on the misty border between solid history and story. Historians are not even certain that Ragnar existed at all, or whether several restless men were gathered up over time into one splendid name. What is not in doubt is that the leaders of this army were men of genuine ability. Holding together a large and fractious host of independent warriors, each with his own pride and his own following, was no small feat. and directing it with strategy and patience across many years was rarer still. This was not a mob washed up on a beach. It was a campaign, waged with cunning at least as much as with force. From Northumbria the army turned elsewhere, pressing into Mercia and then coming back around to East Anglia. And it was there that one of the most famous episodes of the whole invasion was waiting, when a young king named Edmund decided that he would stand. He was defeated, and he was killed. Later tradition holds that he was taken alive, and that when he refused either to give up his faith or to rule as a puppet under heathen masters, he was bound to a tree and shot through with arrows and put to death. Whatever the precise truth of that morning, Edmund was remembered almost at once as a martyr, and the place where his remains eventually came to rest grew into one of the great centres of pilgrimage in England and carries his name still: Bury St. Edmunds. His killing shows the pattern of those years with terrible clarity. One by one the ancient kingdoms were being taken, their kings destroyed or made into servants, their independence simply switched off. By the early 870s, the English position was very nearly hopeless. Northumbria, gone. East Anglia, gone. Mercia, the great kingdom of the Midlands, was coming apart, its king driven into exile overseas, its lands divided, part held directly by the Norse, and part left to a puppet who ruled at the invader's pleasure. 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been swept off the board in less than 10 years. Everywhere the old order was falling in on itself, and the northerners were settling onto the conquered ground, sharing it out among themselves to farm, turning conquest quietly into possession. It seemed only a question of time before all of England answered to men from across the sea, and the English passed out of history as an independent people altogether. One kingdom was still standing, the southern realm of Wessex, and it now faced the full weight of that army alone. Wessex had already tasted the enemy's strength in a run of hard battles, and its prospects looked no better than those of the kingdoms already gone. Its old king had died worn out by the fighting, and the crown had passed through a series of short-lived brothers down to the youngest of them all, a bookish and often sickly young man who had never expected to rule, and who now found himself the last hope of English freedom. Very few would have wagered anything on him, or on his cornered little kingdom. The great heathen army had broken everything else it touched, and there was no obvious reason to think this would be different. And yet here, at the very edge of ruin, the whole story was about to turn. The young King of Wessex would prove to be something nobody had anticipated, a leader of patience and nerve and deep cunning, a man who would be beaten, hunted and driven into hiding, and who would still refuse to end it. He would do what no other English ruler had managed. He would stop the army that could not be stopped. His name was Alfred, and history would hand him a title it has given to no other English king. Behind the cold record of conquest ran a darker current, the tale the Norse told themselves about why the great army had come at all. According to the sagas, the sons of Ragnar had crossed the sea to avenge their father, who was said to have been taken by a Northumbrian king and put to a horrible death, thrown into a pit of serpents, dying unafraid, and promising with his last breath that his sons would come and settle the account. How much of that is history, and how much is later storytelling, nobody can say. But it shows how the invaders wrapped their war in vengeance and destiny, so that it carried a meaning larger than silver. The solid traces of the host, meanwhile, lie in the English earth. At Repton in Derbyshire, one of the places where the army is known to have wintered, archaeologists have uncovered the great ditch of its camp cut into the ground beside the church. And close by, a mass grave holding the jumbled bones of hundreds of people, a striking number of them powerful men in the prime of life, gathered in a way that suggests a warrior host burying its dead very far from home. Finds like that turn the words of frightened chroniclers into something you could almost put a hand on. The physical shadow of a vast army moving across the country, camping through the long winters, thousands of men resting and mending their gear before the next season's work. They were not a legend. They had truly been there, and the ground remembers them. Rest now, with England hanging in the balance and one small kingdom left to carry the whole weight of it. When Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in 871, he inherited a war that already looked lost. The great army had swallowed the other kingdoms, and now it turned the bulk of its strength southward against his. In the first years of his reign, he fought battle after battle, winning a few and losing more, and discovered again and again that even when he beat the Norse in open field, he could not finish them, because they simply withdrew behind their earthworks and waited for him to go away. At times he was reduced to doing exactly what the Franks had done, buying the enemy off with silver to purchase a little breathing room. It was a grinding, thankless kind of war, and it wore his kingdom down year by year. Then, in the depth of winter, when campaigning was supposed to be impossible and a king could reasonably feel safe, the Norse leader Guthrum did what nobody expected. He struck suddenly at a royal estate where Alfred was keeping the season, and the blow came so close to succeeding that the king escaped with only a small band of followers, fleeing west into the wild, wet country of the Somerset marshes. This was the lowest hour of Alfred's life. The last free English ruler, a fugitive in the reeds and the mud, his kingdom overrun, his cause apparently finished, hiding in a landscape of standing water and alder scrub where an army could not easily follow. It is to this desperate winter that the most famous English legend of all belongs. The story that Alfred, sheltering unrecognized in a peasant woman's cottage, was soundly scolded for letting her cakes burn on the hearth while his mind wandered over his ruined country. The tale is almost certainly a later invention, added by a monk hundreds of years afterward. But it caught hold and never let go, because it captured something true, the picture of a great king brought as low as a beggar and quietly enduring it. Alfred did not despair, and that is the true measure of the man. From a fortified refuge deep in the marshes, a place called Athelney, he began gathering up the threads of resistance. He sent secret messengers out to the men of the surrounding shires, telling them to arm themselves and to come to him at an appointed place when the moment came. And through the early weeks of that spring, in the wet, green silence of the marsh, something was quietly being assembled. By the spring of 878, quietly and against every reasonable expectation, the fugitive had rebuilt an army out of the loyal farmers and thanes who still answered when he called. He came out of hiding, gathered his men at a great stone that everyone in those parts knew as a meeting place, and marched to meet Guthrum's host in open battle at a place called Eddington. There, on that field, the long tide of Norse conquest in England finally broke. Alfred's men fought in the tight, disciplined shield wall, shoulder pressed to shoulder, and they held, and then they pushed, and the Norse gave way. This time the victory was complete enough to count for something. Guthrum fled to his stronghold, and Alfred followed him, ringed the place about, and starved him out. What Alfred did next was as shrewd as the victory was hard won. He did not put his beaten enemy to the sword. He made terms instead, and the central term was that Guthrum accept baptism. The Norse leader agreed, and Alfred himself stood as his sponsor at the font, so that two men who had spent years trying to destroy one another now stood in the relation of godfather and godson. It was a masterstroke. It bound the enemy into the same faith and the same web of obligation that governed Christian kings, and turned a raider into a neighbour who could be argued with. Out of that settlement came one of the most consequential arrangements in English history, a division of the land between Alfred's English and Guthrum's Norse. A boundary was drawn running roughly from London up toward the northwest, and the great region lying north and east of that line, where Norse settlers now lived and Norse custom now held, became known as the Danelaw. For a long time to come, England was, in effect, two countries, English Wessex and its allies on one side, the Danelaw on the other, each with its own habits and its own justice. The names those settlers left behind are still on the map. All across the north and east of England sit towns whose names end in the old Norse words for a farmstead or a village, a quiet chart of exactly where the newcomers put down roots. Though historians still argue about what those names really prove, whether they mark a great flood of ordinary Norse families coming to farm, or a much smaller warrior aristocracy whose speech simply became the fashion of the district. Alfred understood that one victory, however sweet, would not be enough. So he spent the peace making certain that Wessex could never be caught so badly off guard again. He reorganized his army so that only half the men were called up at any one time, while the other half stayed home to work the fields, which meant a force was always ready without the kingdom starving itself to keep one. He built a network of fortified towns called burhs, spaced across his lands, so that nowhere lay far from a stronghold where people and goods could shelter and out of which soldiers could strike. He ordered larger ships built to meet the Norse on the water, the first faint seed of an English navy, and he cared about far more than war. He gathered scholars to his court and revived a learning that the raids had come close to extinguishing, and had important books turned into English so that his people might be wise as well as safe. It was in his reign that a great year-by-year record of the kingdom was begun, and it is largely through that chronicle, kept up long after him, that we know this story at all. Alfred did not drive the Norse out of England. The Danelaw stayed where it was, and the struggle would grind on under his children and grandchildren for generations. But he had done what nobody else managed. He had stopped the conquest, saved one English kingdom, and left his heirs a foundation solid enough to push back from. For that, later ages gave him a title they have never given to another English king: Alfred the Great. His real achievement, though, can only be measured in what was built on top of it. His son took up the fight, and so did his daughter, a formidable woman who ruled Mercia in her own right after her husband died, and who worked hand in hand with her brother to plant fortified towns across the middle of the country and press steadily into Norse territory, winning back one region after another. Piece by piece, the lands the great heathen army had swallowed came back under English rule, and the boundary Alfred had been forced to accept moved north year by year. It was Alfred's grandson who finished the work and became, for the first time in all of history, the ruler of a single united English kingdom. He extended his authority over the whole island's English lands, received the submission of the Norse of York and of the kings of the Welsh and the Scots, and when a great alliance of his enemies rose in one last attempt to break him, he shattered them in an enormous battle that was remembered for centuries afterward as the hardest ever fought on British soil. So, out of a desperate stand in a marsh, there grew, in the space of 2 generations, something entirely new: the Kingdom of England. One realm under one crown, forged in the long struggle against the men from the north. Alfred had lit the fire. His grandchildren built it into something that would last. Rest now, with the marsh water still, and the shield wall holding firm at last, and one small kingdom pulled back from the edge of the dark. While armies were clashing in England, another great movement was carrying the Norse in a wholly different direction, not toward conquest, but out into the empty spaces of the open ocean. And that quieter story would, in the end, reach further than any raid. The same restlessness that sent men south to plunder also sent them west, out past the last known islands, looking for new land where a family could farm in peace and answer to nobody. The great prize of that westward searching was a large and lonely island set in the middle of the North Atlantic, a country of volcanoes and glaciers and green summer meadows, which they would name for the ice: Iceland. They were not, it seems, quite the first to stand on it. When their ships arrived, they found traces that a handful of Irish monks, seeking solitude at the outermost edge of the world, had been there before them and had since gone away. But those men had come only to be alone with God, not to build anything. It was the Norse who truly settled the island and made it the home of a lasting people. The migration began in the later 9th century, and over the decades that followed, a steady stream of ships crossed the Northern Sea. They carried everything with them: men, women, and children, and with them the cattle and the sheep and the horses, the tools, the loom weights, the cooking pots, all of it packed into those broad-bellied cargo ships built for precisely this kind of crossing. they came to claim ground, and in an empty country there was ground in plenty for anyone bold enough to cross the water and take it. Part of what pushed them was trouble at home. In these same years, a king called Harald Fairhair was fighting to bring the whole of Norway under one hand, breaking the independent chieftains one after another and offering them a simple choice: submit or lose everything. Many proud men who had governed their own valleys for generations would not bow, and rather than live as subjects where they had been masters, they gathered their households and their followers and sailed away to a place where no king ruled and a free man could be his own lord again. So the settlement of Iceland was in part a flight of the stubborn, a migration of exactly the people least willing to bend, and that left a permanent mark on what they built. Though historians do argue about how much weight to put on Harald, since the sagas that tell us this were written down 300 years later by men who liked a tidy explanation. What they built was a genuine novelty, a whole country with no king in it at all. Instead of a monarch, they governed themselves through assemblies, the local things, where quarrels were judged and decisions taken, and above them all, a great national gathering, the All-Thing, which met once a year in an extraordinary place of black cliffs and open ground where a rift runs through the earth. There the law speaker recited the law aloud from memory. Cases were heard, feuds were settled or freshly inflamed, marriages arranged, news traded, and the whole business of a nation carried on beneath the open sky. First gathered around the year 930, the All-Thing has a fair claim to be among the oldest continuing assemblies of its kind anywhere on earth, and it governed the island for centuries without any king ever setting foot on it as ruler. It was a bold experiment in people governing themselves, and it was not remotely peaceful. Without a strong central power to enforce a judgment, powerful families often settled matters with their own hands, and the long chains of blood feud that resulted would one day fill the greatest of the Icelandic sagas. Life there demanded everything the settlers had. The island was beautiful and hard, and only its coastal fringes and green valleys would support a farm. They raised sheep and cattle, cut hay through the brief summer to keep the animals alive through the long dark, fished seas that swarmed with cod, gathered driftwood, and took the eggs and the meat of seabirds off the cliffs. They also learned the limits of their new home rather quickly. In their eagerness, they cut down most of the island's woodland for timber and fuel and pasture, and the thin soil, once the trees were gone, began to blow and wash away. It is one of the earliest clear lessons in how fast people can wear out a fragile country. Yet they endured and they multiplied, and within a few generations Iceland held a thriving population with its own law, its own literature, and a fierce sense of who it was. And it is to these islanders that we owe a debt almost impossible to overstate, because they became the memory keepers of the entire Norse world. In the calm centuries after they turned Christian, Icelandic writers set down in their own language the sagas and histories and poems that preserve nearly everything we know of Viking belief and legend and deed. Without the quiet work of those farmers bent over manuscripts through the long winters, the gods and heroes of the north would be little more than shadows to us. The raiders won the silver and the fame. The settlers on this remote, treeless island saved the story itself. Chief among them was a chieftain, law speaker, and writer of astonishing gifts named Snorri Sturluson. It was he, and others like him, who gathered up the scattered old poems and traditions and arranged them into orderly books, composing, among other things, a careful guide for poets that explained the myths behind the old buried illusions, the making and the ending of the world, the deeds of Thor and Odin. Without that patient labour, carried out long after the last person had stopped worshipping any of it, we would know almost nothing of the great world tree, or the wolf that will one day swallow the sun, or the last battle at the ending of days. He also set down a magnificent history of the kings of Norway, drawing on verses the old court poets had memorized, and a great share of what we know about this entire age still flows out of his pages. It is one of the quiet wonders of history that so much of what survives about these fierce heathen seafarers reaches us through the pens of their own Christian great-grandchildren, sitting in turf-roofed halls on an island in the middle of the ocean, writing by the light of long summer evenings and the smoky lamps of winter. The very people the raiding age had scattered out to the rim of the world became, generations later, the careful librarians of all of it. Had Iceland never been settled, or had its people never taken up the pen, the Viking Age would be little more to us now than a scatter of horrified entries in foreign chronicles and a few silent objects lifted out of the ground. And Iceland, remarkable as it was, turned out not to be the end of the Western Road, but a stepping stone. From its shores, ships would push on again, across wider and colder and far more dangerous water, toward lands lying at the very rim of the known world, and then past it. The same hunger for new ground that had carried them from Norway now drove a handful of the boldest further still, toward a great ice-bound coast in the west, and then toward something more astonishing yet, a shore that nobody in Europe knew existed at all. They had not stumbled on Iceland all at once, by the way, but found it in stages, and the old accounts keep the names of the men who first saw it. One was blown there by a storm and called it a land of snow. Another sailed all the way around and proved it was an island. But the most colourful of them was a man remembered as Raven Floki, who set out deliberately to find this new country, and who took with him, caged aboard his ship, 3 ravens. He let them go one at a time, far out on the empty water. The first turned back the way they had come. The second circled and returned to the mast. The third rose, took its bearings and flew straight ahead, and Floki followed it toward a coast he could not yet see. He settled for a season in a bay in the west, but he was so delighted with the fishing that he neglected to cut enough hay, and his animals died in the bitter winter that followed. Disappointed and out of temper, he climbed a mountain, looked down on a fjord choked with drifting ice, and named the whole country for it. A hard, cold name, and it stuck fast, and some have wondered whether it quietly did the settlers a favour by keeping the faint-hearted at home. The first to come and stay for good was a chieftain who, as the old custom went, threw the carved wooden pillars of his high seat overboard as he neared the coast, vowing to build wherever the gods chose to carry them ashore. Where they finally washed up, he raised his farm, and the place took a name meaning Smoky Bay, from the steam of hot springs rising into the cold air. It would grow, in time, into Reykjavík. From such small and stubborn beginnings, one determined family at a time, an empty land in the middle of the ocean, slowly filled with farms and people and the first outline of a nation. Rest now, with the assembly gathered on its plain of black cliffs, and the western ocean waiting beyond it, grey and enormous. The next leap west was made by a man whose temper kept getting him into trouble. His name was Erik the Red, called so for the colour of his hair and beard, and, some said, for the heat of his disposition. Erik had come to Iceland as a young man, but he was a quarrelsome sort, and after a run of violent disputes in which men were killed, he was outlawed for 3 years and put out to fend for himself. Rather than sit and wait out the sentence, Erik decided to spend it usefully. He sailed west to explore a great, cold, forbidding land that other sailors had glimpsed from a distance and never touched. For 3 years he worked along its coasts and up its fjords, searching out the few pockets green enough to keep a farm alive, and when his exile expired, he came home to Iceland to recruit. Here Erik demonstrated a keen grasp of human nature. The country he had found was mostly a vast sheet of ice, bleak and unwelcoming, with only thin ribbons of grass along its southern inlets. An honest name would have emptied every ship before it sailed, so he gave it the most inviting name he could think of, and called it the Green Land, reasoning quite openly, as the old accounts admit, that people would be more willing to go somewhere with an attractive name. It may be the earliest recorded instance of a property developer improving a difficult listing with a hopeful label, and it worked. A fleet set out from Iceland carrying settlers, and though many were lost or turned back in the storms of that hard crossing, Enough arrived to plant 2 small colonies along the habitable fjords of the southwestern coast. Against every reasonable expectation, these Norse Greenlanders held on for centuries, grazing sheep and cattle on the narrow green margins, hunting seal and walrus and whale, and shipping the ivory of walrus tusks back to Europe, where it was highly prized and gave a remote colony something worth selling. It was a precarious life, clinging to the skirt of an ice cap at the outer limit of where Europeans could survive, dependent on ships from a homeland thousands of miles away. But for many generations it held. A Christian European society improbably rooted on the shore of a frozen continent, nearer to the New World than to the Old, though nobody living there would have understood the phrase. And it was from Greenland that the Norse took the final step, the one that makes this the most extraordinary chapter in the whole story. Erik the Red had a son named Leif, remembered afterward as Leif the Lucky. It was Leif, or by some accounts a trader who had been blown off course and sighted it before him, who first reached the shores of a new land still further west, a country of forests and rivers and wild grapes, which they called the Land of Vines. Vinland. This was the coast of North America, and they had found it around the year 1000, roughly 5 centuries before any other European crossed that ocean. They had reached a continent whose existence was entirely unknown to the rest of the world, and they had done it in open wooden boats, steering by the sun and the seabirds and the run of the swell beneath the hull. For a long time the story was dismissed as saga boasting with nothing behind it. Then, archaeologists digging at a place called Lons o Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland uncovered the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. The turf outlines of longhouses, iron nails, a bronze cloak pin of northern make, tools for working iron and wood. Here, at last, was proof that the sagas had been telling the truth, and that Norse feet had walked North America 1,000 years ago. Among the debris were butternuts, which do not grow anywhere near Newfoundland, which means somebody from that camp had voyaged a good deal further south. Where exactly Vinland lay, scholars are still arguing about. The site seems to have been a base camp, a place to mend ships and push on down the coast, rather than a town meant to last. And that is the poignant heart of it, because the Norse did not stay. They found a rich new land and they let it go. The reasons are plain enough. It lay impossibly far from home, at the end of a long, fragile chain of settlements reaching all the way back to Norway, and the tiny population of Greenland could never spare enough people to hold a colony an ocean further on. Worse, the country was already inhabited. The Norse called the people they met there by a word meaning something like the wretches, which tells you a good deal about how the meeting went, and relations turned to violence quickly. Caught between the distance and the hostility, the small parties found their foothold impossible to keep, and after a few attempts they gave it up and sailed away, leaving the continent to its own peoples for another 500 years. So they touched the New World and then withdrew from it, and the memory of Vinland thinned into a half-believed story until a spade turned it up again. It may be the most astonishing thing anyone did in those 300 years. A people out of the cold fjords, in open boats, finding a hidden continent, and then quietly turning around because it was simply too far and too hard. The colony Erik founded has a long and haunting afterlife of its own, worth pausing over, because it did not end with him. It lasted something like 4.5 centuries before it vanished. Generation after generation, the Greenlanders farmed those narrow green margins, built small churches of stone, sent their ivory across the water, and kept up, however thinly, their thread of connection to a homeland most of them had never seen. And then, slowly, the world turned against them. The climate, mild when they arrived, cooled as the centuries went on. The growing season shortened, the sea ice crept further south and made the vital crossings to Europe rarer and more dangerous. The market for walrus ivory faded as other sources came back into the trade. Ships called less and less often, and then they stopped calling at all. What became of the last of them is one of the quiet mysteries of history. The final written record we have is a note of an ordinary wedding held in one of their churches on a September day, and after that the silence simply closes over. When European ships found their way back centuries later, they discovered the settlements empty, the halls open to the sky, the fields gone back to scrub, and nobody left to say what had happened. Whether the last families starved as the cold deepened, or gave up and sailed for Iceland, or were worn down over years and quietly absorbed elsewhere, nobody knows even now. Their long, stubborn stand at the outer edge of the habitable world had simply ended, leaving ruins on a frozen shore and a sober reminder of how thin the thread can be that holds a people to a place. Rest now, with wild grapes ripening on an unknown coast, and the little wooden ships turning their carved prows back toward home across the empty western sea. While Norway and Denmark looked west and south toward Britain and the Frankish lands, Sweden looked in an entirely different direction, and there wrote a chapter of the age that is far less famous and every bit as remarkable. Instead of crossing open ocean to raid monasteries, these Eastern Norsemen turned inland, into the enormous river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine, and used those rivers as roads into the heart of a continent. Where the Western Vikings are remembered for their axes, the Eastern ones are remembered nearly as much for their trade goods and their little folding scales, though they could fight ferociously when it suited them. The peoples they met among the Slavs called them by a name that has echoed ever since: the Rus. And from that name, most historians believe, Russia would eventually take its own, though the question is argued over with surprising heat to this day. The land they entered was nothing like empty Iceland. It was thinly settled by Slavic and Finnic peoples and laced with great, slow rivers running south toward warm and wealthy seas. The Norse saw the possibility at once. By rowing and sailing down these rivers and hauling their light boats overland across the portages between one river system and the next, a determined crew could travel from the cold Baltic all the way to the Black Sea and the Caspian, and so reach the two greatest civilizations of the age, the Christian Empire of Byzantium and the Muslim world of the Caliphate. Along these water roads, the Rus planted fortified trading posts that grew into towns, and two of those towns became centers of real power: Novgorod in the north and Kyiv further south, which would become the seed of a mighty state. According to the old chronicles, the beginnings of it were bound up with a Norse leader named Rurik, who was either invited in to rule or forced his way in, depending on which account you believe, and whose kinsmen extended their grip down the rivers. Whatever the truth behind those misty stories, it is clear that a warrior and merchant elite of northern origin came to rule a largely Slavic population, and that across the generations the two simply merged. The Norse rulers took on the language and the customs of the far more numerous people they governed, until the distinction wore away entirely, and a new people and a new realm stood in its place. The land of the Rus was one of the great meeting places of the age, where the northern world dissolved into the Slavic one. What drew them down those rivers above all was trade, and what they carried came out of the northern forests. Furs of every kind, beeswax and honey, amber gathered off the Baltic shore, and, grimly, people. The eastern traffic in captives was vast and hugely profitable, feeding the markets of the wealthy south with a steady stream of the enslaved, and it is not possible to tell this story honestly without saying so. In return, the Rus received the one thing the North wanted more than anything else: silver. It came pouring out of the mines of the Islamic world in the form of coins, and archaeologists still turn them up by the tens of thousands across Scandinavia. Hordes of Arabic dirhams buried under Swedish farmland by men who never came back for them. That river of eastern silver, far more than any plunder taken in the West, is what truly made the Norse world rich, and it flowed because these traders had opened the long road to Baghdad. The greatest magnet of all waited at the far end of it. The city the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City, which we know as Constantinople, capital of Byzantium and the largest and wealthiest place in Europe. To a man arriving from a timber town in the northern forests, it must have seemed scarcely credible. 500,000 people. A great church crowned with a dome that appeared to float on nothing but light. Markets heaped with silk and gold and spices out of countries he had no name for. They came to it first as raiders, bringing fleets across the Black Sea to throw themselves at the walls, and more than once they were driven off by its formidable defences and by a terrifying secret weapon, a liquid fire that clung and burned even on the surface of the water. But raiding gave way to trading. Treaties were struck that allowed northern merchants to come each year and do business under careful rules, lodged outside the walls, admitted through one gate at a time, and unarmed. In time, the relationship grew closer still. The emperors came to prize these enormous, fearless northern fighting men and began hiring them as an elite bodyguard, remembered ever after as the Varangian Guard. For centuries, that corps of northern and later English warriors stood at the emperor's shoulder, trusted precisely because they were strangers with no stake in the endless plotting of the court, loyal only to the man who paid them so extraordinarily well. Service in it became a road to fabulous wealth, and young men sailed the whole length of the world from Scandinavia and even from Iceland to take the emperor's coin and come home rich and insufferable. One of them, or someone very like him, left behind a small human trace of that journey. High up on a marble railing inside the great church of Holy Wisdom, a bored guardsman scratched his name into the stone in runes, so that among the gold mosaics of Byzantium there survives to this day a piece of graffiti that seems to say, more or less, that Halfdan was here. There is something quietly delightful in it, the restless northern spirit, having reached the grandest building in the Christian world, doing exactly what idle young men have always done, and carving his name where he had been told not to. Through these eastern adventurers, the reach of the Norse stretched almost past imagining. From the ice of Greenland in the west, to the golden domes of Constantinople and the bazaars of Central Asia in the east, a single people, setting out from a handful of cold harbours, had thrown a web of raiding and trading and settlement across a quarter of the world. And the silver they gathered on the river road did not simply sit in their purses. It flowed back into a growing network of trade and towns that was quietly transforming the homelands themselves, turning raiders into merchants and villages into cities. The road to the great city was long and dangerous, and we know a surprising amount about how it was travelled. Each year the Rus gathered their goods and their boats and set off down the wide Dnieper toward the Black Sea. The hardest passage came at a series of great rapids where the river tumbled over rock no hull could survive. There the crews had to unload everything, haul the vessels out of the water, and drag and carry them overland along the bank, step by weary step, until the smooth water returned below. A Byzantine emperor, curious about these northerners who appeared every summer in his empire, actually wrote down the names of the 7 rapids in both the Norse and the Slavic tongues, a small and precious record that lets us hear the 2 languages of the Rus standing side by side across 1,000 years. Worse than the labour was the danger, because at exactly those places where men were burdened and strung out in a thin line along the bank and could not form up and fight as a body, the horsemen of the open grasslands lay waiting to fall on the stragglers. The yearly voyage was a gauntlet of back-breaking portage and lurking ambush, and only the promise of the markets at the far end made it worth the risk. That they made it year after year and grew wealthy on it says a good deal about both their toughness and their appetite. For once, we also have an eyewitness, written by an outsider. A learned Arab traveller sent from Baghdad on an embassy to the peoples of the Volga met a party of the Rus camped along the river and set down what he saw with a striking mixture of admiration and distaste. He described them as tall and magnificent, fair and ruddy, marked with dark patterns from fingertips to neck, every man with an axe and a knife close at hand. He marvelled at their bodies and recoiled from what he judged their filthy habits, though scholars are quick to note that his standards of cleanliness were those of a sophisticated Baghdad court, and he was measuring river camp life against a very high bar. Above all, he witnessed and recorded in careful detail the funeral of one of their chieftains, and it is among the most extraordinary descriptions to survive from the entire age. The dead man was laid in his ship with rich goods and food and slaughtered animals around him. After 10 days of feasting and solemn ritual, the vessel and everything in it were set alight on the shore, and a great mound was raised over the ashes when the fire had done its work. Through that stranger's eyes we can still watch, across more than 1,000 years, the smoke of a ship funeral climbing over a river in the heart of Russia. It is a window onto beliefs about death and the road beyond it that the Norse themselves left almost entirely unwritten. One of the great accidents of history, that a traveller from another civilization happened to be standing there with a pen. Rest now, with the longboats gliding down wide, slow rivers under a southern sun, bound for the great city at the edge of the world. Beneath all the drama of raids and battles and daring voyages ran a quieter current that in many ways mattered more: trade. For all their fearsome reputation, the Norse were among the great merchants of their age, and the same ships and the same men who could descend on a monastery could just as easily arrive at a market with a hold full of goods to sell. To see this age only as an age of plunder is to miss half of what was happening. Beside the sword there was always the scale, and over time the wealth that flowed through Norse hands as ordinary commerce dwarfed anything ever taken by force. The North was becoming a hub in a network of exchange that reached across the whole known world. The clearest sign is the silver itself. All across Scandinavia, buried in the ground for safekeeping in troubled seasons and never dug up again, lie hoards of coin. And a great many of those coins were struck not anywhere in Europe, but in the mints of the distant Islamic world. Hundreds of thousands of them have come out of northern soil, mute evidence of a trade running all the way from the markets of Central Asia up the Russian rivers and into the far north. The Norse did not, for the most part, use these coins as money in the way we would, counting them out at face value. They treated silver as a substance rather than a currency, weighing it. A merchant would chop coins and broken ornaments into fragments and weigh the pieces on small folding scales to settle a price, so that a man carried his wealth as a pouch of bright scraps and measured out exactly as much of it as the bargain required. Those little scales and the neat sets of weights that went with them turn up again and again wherever the Norse did business. In a grave, they mark out a merchant as surely as a blade marks out a fighting man. To handle all this exchange, the Norse built true towns, something their world had largely done without. The greatest of them was Hedeby at the base of the Danish peninsula, superbly placed where cargo could be carried the short distance overland between the North Sea and the Baltic, instead of making the long, dangerous voyage around the top of Denmark. Hedeby grew into a crowded, noisy place of craftsmen and merchants, its lanes packed with workshops where smiths and jewellers and comb makers and leather workers plied their trades, its harbour thick with masts from a dozen countries. Across the Baltic lay another great market town, Birka, on its island in a Swedish lake, and there were others besides, each a knot in the same web, each a place where the goods of distant regions changed hands. These towns were something genuinely new in the north, permanent centres of manufacture and commerce. They mark the moment when Norse society began to grow more complex and more connected, and far wealthier than a world of scattered farms could ever have become on its own. The goods moving through them came from every corner of the Norse reach. Out of the far north came furs, walrus ivory, rope cut in spirals from walrus hide, eiderdown, and live falcons, prized by the nobility of countries whose names the trappers never learned. From the Baltic shore came amber, that warm fossil resin they loved for jewellery. From the town workshops came fine metalwork, weapons and ornaments. And into the north flowed silk and spices and wine and glass and silver, so that a wealthy household might eat from imported vessels and dress in cloth that had begun its journey thousands of miles away. The people so often pictured as isolated barbarians were plugged into one of the widest trading systems the world had yet produced. Yet the picture must not be painted too gently, because one of the largest and most profitable of all these trades was the trade in human beings. Slavery ran deep through Norse society, and the taking and selling of captives was a central pillar of the economy, not an occasional cruelty, but a steady business. Many of the raids that fill the chronicles were in part slaving expeditions. The people seized in Ireland, in Britain, in the Slavic lands of the East, were marched to market and sold onward, and many of them ended their lives in households far to the south. The very word we still use, slave, carries in its origin a memory of the Slavic peoples, so many of whom were sold in that traffic. It is a dark thread, and an honest account cannot pull it out. A great part of the silver that made the North rich was quite literally the price of other people's freedom. That grim commerce had its own capitals, and chief among them was Dublin, which became one of the busiest slave markets in Western Europe. Captives taken across Ireland and Britain were brought there to be bought and sold and shipped on to distant buyers, and the profits helped build the town. It is an uncomfortable truth that some of the most prosperous and sophisticated centres of the Norse world rested partly on the buying and selling of the unfree, and that the same holds which carried amber and furs and beautiful silverwork also carried men and women taken from their homes and bound for a life of bondage, a long way from anywhere they knew. This web of trade did more than enrich individuals. It slowly remade Norse society itself. Towns needed protection and order, which encouraged the rise of stronger rulers who could provide both. The wealth flowing through the markets gave ambitious chieftains the means to hire followers, build ships, and press their authority over their neighbours. And the constant contact with the great kingdoms and empires of the south exposed the north to new ideas, new fashions, and above all, to new ways of organising a state, with kings and minted money and a single official religion. The merchant, in his quiet way, was carrying home more than silver and silk. He was carrying the seeds of a transformation that would eventually turn a loose world of independent chieftains into organised Christian kingdoms. The trade routes, without meaning to, were laying the groundwork for the very changes that would bring this whole age to a close. You can watch that change in something as small as how they handled money. In the early days, they had no coinage of their own and cared nothing for whose face was stamped on a piece of metal, valuing it purely by weight. But as kings grew stronger and towns grew larger, the rulers of the north began striking their own coins, marked with their own names and symbols, because the right to mint is a mark of real kingship, a way of announcing authority and taking a profit from the trade passing through your land. The shift from chopped fragments on a balance to proper minted coin was a quiet revolution. It meant the Norse world was growing into organised states, with rulers who governed markets rather than chieftains who merely robbed them. Not that any of it lasted forever in the same place. Birka, after 2 busy centuries, was simply abandoned, its harbour left to the reeds, and historians still argue about why. Perhaps the land itself rose and the water grew too shallow for ships. Perhaps the eastern silver dried up. Perhaps the trade simply moved a short way north to a newer town with a newer name. Rest now amid the din of the marketplace, the ring of a smith's hammer, the soft click of silver on the scales, and the north growing quietly, steadily richer. For most of this age, as we have seen, there was no such thing as a king of Denmark or a king of Norway in any full sense of the words. There were many local chieftains and petty kings instead, each ruling his own district, each jealous of his own independence, tied to the others only by shifting alliances and frequent feuds. But across the 9th and 10th centuries, a great change came over the homelands, as ambitious and powerful men began the long and bloody work of gathering those scattered lordships into single kingdoms. The age that had opened with raiders slipping out of 100 separate harbours would end with organised nations under mighty kings. How that happened is really the story of the North growing into the shape of the countries we know today. In Norway, the first great step, as we heard, was taken by Harald Fairhair, who, according to tradition, swore that he would neither cut nor comb his hair until he had made himself master of the whole country, and who fought his way to dominance over its many small kings. the unification was rough, and it did not entirely hold after him, and Norway would be fought over and split apart again more than once. But he had planted an idea that all of it might one day answer to a single crown, and that idea never quite went away. And it was his consolidation, remember, that drove so many independent-minded chieftains to sail for Iceland rather than kneel, so that the making of the Norwegian kingdom and the settling of the Atlantic were two halves of one story. It was in Denmark, though, richest and most central of the Norse lands, that the building of a true kingdom went furthest and left the clearest monument. There, in the 10th century, a king called Gorm the Old ruled from a place named Jelling, and it was his son who finished the work and announced it to the world. That son carries one of the most memorable names in history, Harald Bluetooth, so called, it is thought, for a dead or discoloured tooth. He was a formidable ruler who tightened his grip over the whole of Denmark and for a time claimed lordship over parts of Norway as well, drawing the northern lands together as nobody had managed before. Under him, Denmark became something recognisable as a state, with a king who could command labour and warriors across an entire country. 1,000 years later, when engineers needed a name for a technology meant to unite different devices under one standard, they reached back and borrowed his, and the little symbol on your phone is made of his initials in runes. The evidence of his power still stands in the Danish earth, and it is astonishing. He was a great builder. Among his works was a series of ring fortresses, perfectly circular strongholds laid out with such geometric exactness that only a ruler able to organize enormous numbers of men could possibly have raised them. He strengthened the great defensive wall across the base of the peninsula that guarded the land from enemies to the south. He built roads and bridges, including one across a marsh so long and so level that its oak piles are still down there in the peat. All of this speaks of a central authority the Norse world had not known before. A king who could gather the resources of a whole kingdom and bend them to a purpose, rather than a chieftain leading the men of his own hall. But his greatest monument is a pair of carved stones at Jelling, and on the larger of them he left what amounts to the birth certificate of a nation. In runes cut into granite, Harald declared that he had won all of Denmark and Norway for himself, and that he had made the Danes Christian. Those few lines are the first appearance of the name Denmark anywhere inside the country itself, and they mark the moment a loose collection of northern territories announced itself as a single Christian kingdom under one crown. The stone, with its bold carved figure of Christ tangled in interlace, is treasured to this day as a founding monument of the Danish nation, a place where you can stand and read a king's own words, describing the making of his country. Whether the Danes were quite as Christian as he claimed is another matter, and historians tend to read that line as an ambition dressed up as an accomplishment. Notice what he chose to boast about, though, because it tells you how the world was turning. He was proud not only of conquest, but of conversion. This was no accident. All across the north, the powerful men building kingdoms were coming to see that a religion of many gods and many independent priests and chieftains did not suit the sort of orderly, centralized, respectable state they wished to rule. The great Christian empires to the south, with their one God, their kings anointed by the church, their learning and their written law, offered a model of power that ambitious northern rulers increasingly wanted for themselves. To be a Christian king was to be a real king in the eyes of the wider world, the equal of the rulers of Francia and Byzantium, rather than a heathen chief out on the barbarous fringe. So the rise of kings and the coming of the cross marched together, two faces of a single transformation. As the petty chieftains were gathered under great crowns, the old gods were edged aside in favour of the new one, and the whole character of the North began to shift from the wild independence of the raiding years toward the settled order of a medieval Christian kingdom. Sweden, the third of these lands, came together more slowly and by its own road. It was made up of several distinct peoples, chief among them the Svea around the Great Lake country and the Goethe to their south. and the welding of those into one realm was a gradual and often obscure business that ran on well past the time when Denmark and Norway had taken clear shape. Its first ruler, generally counted as a Christian king, came later than his southern neighbours, and for a long while the old religion held on stubbornly in the Swedish heartland, where a great heathen temple was still drawing worshippers when much of the rest of the north had already turned. Sweden's face, as we have seen, was always angled as much toward the Baltic and the river roads beyond it as toward the west. Those ring fortresses, meanwhile, were more than monuments to royal pride. Ringed by high earthen walls and divided inside into neat quarters of longhouses, laid out with a precision that still surprises surveyors, they were barracks and assembly points, places where a king could gather and house and drill large bodies of fighting men. It is thought that some of them served as staging grounds for the renewed invasions of England that were coming, the mustering places where the fleets and armies of a Danish king were assembled before they sailed. The very earth and timber of the north were being organised now for war on a national scale. No longer the private affair of one chieftain and his followers, but the deliberate work of a whole kingdom gathering its strength. And yet the deepest change of all was not made of earth or timber at all. The turning of the Norse world to Christianity was among the most profound events of the entire age, and it did not happen all at once, or anywhere in quite the same way. In some places it arrived gently, through the patient work of missionaries and the slow drift of custom. In others it was driven through by force, by kings who broke the old worship with fire, and for a long stretch of years the two faiths simply lived alongside one another, mingling and overlapping, before the cross finally won. To understand how the Vikings stopped being the Vikings, you have to follow this long, uneven turning. Christianity had been touching the edges of their world for a long time before it triumphed. Missionaries had ventured north even during the raiding years, and Norse merchants and warriors who spent time in Christian countries, at the markets, in the pay of Christian kings, standing guard in the great city on the Bosphorus, could hardly avoid brushing up against the new faith and the wealthy, orderly world that came with it. Many of them took a halfway position, accepting a preliminary blessing that allowed them to trade and mix freely with Christians, while stopping short of full baptism, keeping a foot comfortably in each camp. For a practical trading people, this made excellent sense, and it meant Christian ideas were soaking into the north through ordinary daily contact, long before any king ordered anything. For a while, the two religions simply shared the same ground, and the archaeology shows it beautifully. There survives a soapstone mould made by some admirably canny craftsman, cut to cast both the cross of Christ and the hammer of Thor, so that he could sell a holy pendant to a customer of either persuasion, or perhaps to one who wanted to be covered both ways. People wore the little hammer as a protective charm, even as the cross spread through their villages, hedging quietly, honouring the new God without quite letting go of the old ones. Conversion, for ordinary people, was rarely a lightning bolt through the soul. It was a slow shift, in which the new God was at first simply added to the others as a powerful ally, and only gradually came to replace them, as the churches went up and the old shrines fell silent. Where the change came fastest, it came from the top down. We have seen Harald Bluetooth carving his boast into granite, tying the new faith directly to the making of his kingdom. In Norway, the process was harsher. There, a king named Olaf Tryggvason, who had been a formidable raider himself before his conversion, set about forcing Christianity on his people with ruthless energy, offering the chieftains a stark choice between the font and his anger. He pulled down the old shrines, punished those who clung to the old gods, and drove the new faith forward by will and violence rather than by gentle persuasion. For rulers of that stamp, Christianity was not only a matter of belief, it was a matter of power, a way to bind a kingdom under one God exactly as it was being bound under one king, and to join the respectable family of Christian nations. Not everywhere was it so bloody. In Iceland, that country of free farmers governing themselves in the open air, the question threatened to tear the young society apart, as Christians and heathens hardened into hostile camps that looked ready to come to blows and split the island in two. But the Icelanders, in a moment that shows their peculiar genius for law, chose to settle it by judgment rather than by fighting. Around the year 1000, at the Althing, they placed the entire dispute in the hands of a single respected law speaker, a heathen himself, and agreed in advance to abide by whatever he decided. He withdrew and lay down beneath a cloak for a day and a night, saying nothing, turning it over. Then he rose and delivered his ruling. For the sake of peace, and so that the country should not have two laws and therefore no law at all Icelanders should accept baptism and be Christian in public, while those who wished might quietly keep certain of the old customs in private for a time. And so an entire nation changed its religion by the reasoned decision of its own assembly, without a drop of blood, which must stand as one of the most remarkable conversions in all of history. The coming of the church changed far more than the names people prayed to. It changed the whole texture of life. The dead, who had once gone into the earth with their weapons and their goods and sometimes their ships around them, were now laid in plain graves facing the rising sun, their journey entrusted to the mercy of God rather than to the treasure heaped at their side. Churches rose where shrines had stood, and with the priests came the written word on a scale the North had never known, books and Latin, and the simple revolutionary habit of setting things down on parchment. It was under the wing of Christianity, remember, that the Icelanders would later write out the very sagas that preserve the memory of the pagan world their great-grandparents had lived in. Slavery weakened slowly under the same influence. The whole moral world of the people shifted, however imperfectly, away from the fierce code of honor and vengeance that fills the sagas toward the ideals of the new religion. And by the close of the age, the transformation was all but complete. The Norse had become Christian peoples, ruled by Christian kings, worshipping in stone churches, burying their dead in consecrated ground, taking their place among the ordinary nations of medieval Europe. Odin and Thor and Freya faded out of worship and into story, remembered as characters in tales rather than powers to be feared and fed. Something wild and particular was passing out of the world, and something more settled and more familiar was arriving to take its place. The old religion did not give way everywhere without a struggle. Its last great stronghold was that heathen sanctuary in the Swedish heartland at Uppsala. A churchman writing from a comfortable distance in Germany left a famous and lurid account of it, describing a temple gleaming with gold where images of the great gods stood side by side, and a sacred grove beside it in which terrible offerings were made every 9th year. Historians treat that description with a good deal of caution, since the man never went within 500 miles of the place, and had every reason to make the heathens sound as dreadful as possible. But something was certainly there, and it held on stubbornly for a long time after the rest of the North had turned. And before the age closed, the Norse would blaze up one last time, in a burst of royal ambition, as a Danish king came astonishingly close to binding the whole world of the northern seas into a single empire. Such holdouts could not last. As the Christian kings extended their reach and the new faith spread down from the courts into the villages, the old temples were pulled down at last. The sacred groves were felled, and churches went up on the very ground where the gods had been honoured. The change was not always welcome. There were districts where people held quietly to the old ways for generations, folding a little of the ancient practice into their new Christian lives, keeping a charm in a pocket, saying an old word over a sick animal. But the great public religion, with its temples and its festivals and its offerings, faded out of the world until it survived only in memory, and in the tales a later Christian generation would take up their pens to write down. Rest now, with a little hammer and a cross lying side by side in a craftsman's mould, as one age of belief gives way, slowly and without much noise, to the next. Just when it might have seemed that the great days of Norse power were dissolving into the ordinary business of Christian kingship, the age rose to one final dazzling height. In the early 11th century, a Danish king came to rule not only Denmark, but England and Norway besides, holding together an empire that ringed the northern seas, so that for a brief and brilliant span, the whole world around the North Sea answered to a single crown. The man who did it was Cnut, remembered as Cnut the Great, and his reign is in many ways the summit of the entire Viking Age, the moment when the descendants of the raiders sat on the thrones of the very lands their grandfathers had plundered. The road to it ran through a renewed assault on England. After the long peace that Alfred's descendants had built, a second great wave of Danish attacks broke over the country, and this time the English king was a weak and unlucky ruler, remembered by a cruel nickname, Unready, which in its older sense meant not lazy but ill-advised, badly counselled. Under him, England was wealthy and well-organised and wretchedly led. Again and again the English tried to buy the raiders off with enormous payments of silver, which only advertised how much there was to be had and brought the fleets back for more. Then, in a moment of panic and cruelty, the king ordered a massacre of Danes living in England, an act that enraged the Danish king and handed him every excuse he needed for revenge. Historians still argue about how wide that massacre really was, whether it swept the whole country as the chroniclers imply, or fell mainly on a few towns, though the burnt layer archaeologists found beneath an Oxford college, along with the bones of men killed in a single terrible episode, suggests the accounts were not simply invented. That Danish king was Sweyn Forkbeard, Cnut's father, and he pressed his attacks with growing success until, near the end of his life, he drove the English king into exile and made himself ruler of England outright. Sweyn died almost immediately after his triumph, and the crown was fought over for a time between his son and the old English royal line, in hard campaigning up and down the country. But Cnut prevailed. By the year 1016, after the death of the exiled king and then of his brave son, Cnut stood master of England. A young Danish prince ruling the ancient kingdom Alfred had saved from the Norse a little over a century before. The wheel had turned entirely around. He then inherited and secured the throne of Denmark, and in time brought Norway under his hand as well, so that this one man ruled a great arc of lands and waters, England and Denmark and Norway together, with claims and influence over parts of Sweden and the Scottish Isles. Historians call it the North Sea Empire, and it made him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, a monarch whose friendship was courted by emperors and popes. He travelled to Rome and took his place among the great Christian kings of the continent, where he used the occasion shrewdly, negotiating better terms and safer roads for English merchants and pilgrims crossing the Alps. The grandson of heathen raiders, received with honour at the heart of Christendom. The most striking thing about Cnut is that, having taken England by the sword, he chose to rule it well rather than as a foreign conqueror grinding down a beaten people. He kept the good old English laws. He worked with English nobles and English churchmen. He governed as an English king rather than a Danish overlord, and the country prospered under his firm and even hand. He was a generous patron of the church, endowing monasteries and doing public penance for the violence that had carried him up. He married the widow of the king he had displaced, binding himself to the old royal house. And he gave England something it had badly wanted for a generation, a long stretch of strong, stable, peaceful government. For all that he arrived as an invader, he proved one of the more capable and constructive kings medieval England ever had. It is to Cnut that the most famous of all English royal legends attaches, the story of the King and the Tide, and it is worth telling properly because it is so regularly told backwards. As the tale goes, Cnut had grown weary of the flattery of his courtiers, who assured him that he was so mighty that even the sea would obey him. So he had his throne carried down to the shore and set at the edge of the water, and there he commanded the rising tide to halt and not to wet his royal feet. The water, naturally, paid him no attention whatsoever, and came in exactly as it always had, soaking the king in front of the entire court. But he had staged the whole thing deliberately. He turned to his fawning attendants, dripping, and told them to observe how empty the power of kings really was, that not even he could command the sea, and that only God, who rules the waves, is truly all-powerful. Far from a fool who imagined he could stop the tide, the Cnut of the story is a wise man rebuking the vanity of earthly power, and it makes a fitting emblem for a thoughtful reign. And yet the great empire he built rested almost entirely on his own remarkable person, which is the most fragile foundation there is. When he died, still not an old man, the thing began to come apart in the hands of those who followed him. Within a few years, the arc of lands he had gathered was broken up and quarrelled over by sons and rivals, none of whom had his gift for holding so many different peoples in one hand. England slipped back to a king of the old native line, and the brief moment when the whole northern world answered to one crown simply passed. It was the last and greatest flowering of Viking power, and it faded almost as fast as it had opened. The way Cnut governed England repays a closer look, because it shows a conqueror who had learned that a kingdom is held more securely by good rule than by fear. He divided the country into a small number of great provinces, each governed by a powerful earl acting in the king's name, and under him certain of those earls rose to enormous strength. Chief among them was a man named Godwin, whom the king raised up to govern the rich south, and whose family would loom very large indeed in the years to come. He issued a code of laws drawn from the good old customs of the English. He took considerable care to be seen as a lawful Christian monarch rather than a foreign tyrant, and when he made his journey to Rome, he sent home an open letter to the people of England, promising to rule them justly and to lighten their burdens, a document in which you can still hear the slightly anxious voice of a king who very much wanted to be thought good and godly. Yet for all that care, he could not secure anything beyond his own lifetime. The sons who followed him onto the English throne were lesser men, and they ruled only briefly before dying young, one after another, so that within a few years of his death, his line had simply run out. The crown passed back to the old English house, to a pious and unwarlike king named Edward, later called the Confessor, and beneath that restored king the great earls Cnut had raised, and above all the family of Godwin, had grown so powerful that they overshadowed the throne itself. In these quiet years the stage was being set, plank by plank, for the crisis that would arrive when Edward at last died, with no child to follow him. Rest now, with the tide rolling gently in around a wise king's chair, and the greatest of the northern empires shining for one bright moment before the dusk. While all this was being arranged in England and Denmark, the third of Cnut's kingdoms was living through a struggle of its own that would leave a far deeper mark than any of the empire building around it. Norway was always the hardest of the northern lands to rule, a country of steep valleys and proud scattered chieftains who had never taken kindly to a single master. The effort to make it both a united kingdom and a Christian one came to a head in the life and the death of one determined man. His name was Olaf Haraldsson, and though he lost his kingdom and his life, he would win something far larger in the end, becoming the patron saint of Norway and the enduring symbol of the nation itself. Olaf had begun, like so many men in this story, as a raider, sailing and fighting far from home in his youth. He spent time in Christian countries and took the new faith deeply to heart. And when he came home, he set out to make himself king over the whole of Norway and to finish its conversion. He pressed the new religion on his people with a hard hand, pulling down the old worship wherever he found it, and at the same time pushed his royal authority into districts that had governed themselves since anyone could remember. Doing both at once made him a great many enemies. The old chieftains resented the god he forced on them, and resented even more the crown pressing down on their ancient independence. Their resentment gave Cnut his opening. He wanted Norway too, and he was rich enough to buy what he did not care to fight for. He worked on the discontented Norwegian nobles with promises and with gifts of silver, turning them steadily against their own king, until Olaf found the ground gone from under his feet. Faced with a rising of his own chieftains backed by the wealth and weight of the North Sea Empire, he was driven out and forced into exile, fleeing east to take refuge among his kinsmen in the land of the Rus. For a while it seemed that Cnut had added a kingdom to his collection without a battle, simply by paying the right men at the right moment. But Olaf would not accept it. After a time in exile, he gathered what followers he could and came back to win his country by force. In the year 1030, he marched into his old realm and met his enemies, a great gathering of the chieftains and farmers who had turned against him, at a place called Stiklestad. There, in one of the most famous battles in all of Scandinavian history, his smaller force was overwhelmed and the king himself was cut down on the field. Among the men who fought beside him and got away was his own half-brother, a boy of 15 carried wounded from the battle and smuggled east, who would in time take service in the Emperor's Guard at Constantinople, grow enormously rich and enormously dangerous, and come back into this story at its very end. In the plainest terms, Stiklestad was a total defeat. The king was dead, the rebellion crushed, his enemies triumphant, and Cnut's grip on Norway apparently secure. By every ordinary measure, Olaf had failed completely, dying beaten on a battlefield in his own country. The chroniclers say the sun darkened as he fell, though astronomers point out that the eclipse they mean happened a month later, which historians have been arguing about pleasantly ever since. And then something strange happened. Something that turned a dead and defeated king into a far greater power than the living one had ever been. Stories began to spread that miracles attended his body, that the slain king's remains were found untouched by decay, that healings and wonders occurred at his grave. Very quickly, Olaf came to be venerated as a saint and a martyr, a holy king who had died for the faith he had worked so hard to plant. He was declared a saint. His body was enshrined with honour in the great church at Nidaros, the town we now call Trondheim, and his shrine became the most important place of pilgrimage in the whole of the north, drawing the faithful from across Scandinavia and far beyond it. In death he conquered where in life he had been beaten, and the consequences of that long outlasted Cnut's empire, because the cult of St. Olaf gave the new faith deep roots in Norwegian soil. Norway now had its own holy king, its own martyr, a saint who belonged to the nation itself. Around his memory there gathered something larger still, a sense of Norwegian identity, a feeling that this was a real kingdom favoured by heaven and possessed of its own patron, and not merely a province to be bought and sold by foreign emperors with deep purses. So when the North Sea Empire came apart, it was under the banner of Olaf's memory, and with his young son brought home from exile in the east, that Norway reclaimed itself. The boy was set on the throne by the very people who had risen against his father, because the memory of the saint had turned the nation's heart, and he is remembered as Magnus the Good. Under him and those who came after, Norway held to its independence, and to the faith Olaf had died pressing on it. His shrine at Nidaros became the spiritual centre of the kingdom, and in later centuries a great cathedral rose over the place where he lay, with pilgrims making their way toward it from across the north along roads worn smooth by generations of feet. He came to hold a place no ordinary ruler holds. He was named the Eternal King of Norway, a monarch reigning in heaven above the earthly kings who came and went below, and his emblem, the axe, was worked into the arms of the realm, where it remains to this day. So the battle that Olaf lost became the victory that made a nation, and a hard-handed king rejected and killed by his own people was transformed, by his death and by the stories that gathered afterward, into the changeless symbol of their faith. Few men in all of history have gained so much by losing everything. And there is a lesson in it about this whole age, that what an event came to mean afterward could matter far more than who actually won the fight. Rest now, with pilgrims filing toward a martyr's shrine in the northern dusk, and a beaten king risen into a nation's undying emblem. With Norway Christian and conscious of itself, with Denmark a settled kingdom, with the old empire dissolved, the Viking world was very nearly finished with its long transformation. There remained only one last convulsion, one final roll of the dice by one last great Norse king, and it would fall inside a single fateful year that closed the age forever. That year is 1066. And the age ends with the death of a man who was, in many ways, the last true Viking to sit on a throne. His name was Harald, called Hardrada, a nickname meaning the hard ruler or the ruthless, and his life reads like the whole of this story compressed into one extraordinary career. He is the boy we left being carried wounded off the field at Stiklestad. From there he made his way east, exactly as so many northern adventurers did, into the land of the Rus and onward to Constantinople, where he served for years in the Varangian Guard. In the emperor's service he fought across the Mediterranean world, in the islands and on distant campaigns, and won fame and, above all, an immense fortune in pay and plunder, so much of it that he had to ship the treasure home in stages. There survives, in a Greek book of advice written for a Byzantine emperor, a passing note about a northern prince of royal blood who served loyally in the guard and was allowed to go home with the emperor's goodwill, and it is almost certainly him, glimpsed for a moment through foreign eyes at the height of his adventuring. When he came back to the north at last, laden with the wealth of the great city, he used it to make himself King of Norway, the very throne his half-brother the Saint had died holding. For 20 years he ruled it with an iron hand and earned his grim name, spending much of that time in hard, inconclusive warfare against Denmark, which he wanted badly and never got. He was by any measure the mightiest warrior king of his generation anywhere in the north, a living survival of the old spirit, hungry for glory and for land. And as he grew older, he turned his eye toward the greatest prize of all, England. England that year was in the middle of a succession crisis. Its king, Edward the Confessor, had died without a son, and the throne was claimed at once by several powerful men. Harald Godwinson, son of that same Godwinner whom Cnut had raised up, and by now the greatest lord in the country, was chosen and crowned by the English. But across the water in Normandy, Duke William insisted that the crown had been promised to him and began preparing to take it. And away in the north, Harald Hardrada advanced a claim of his own, resting on an old agreement between Magnus the Good and one of Cnut's sons, which historians have generally found rather thin, and resolved to take England by conquest, as Cnut had done half a century before. To make matters worse for the new English king, his own estranged brother Tostig threw in his lot with the Norwegian and guided the invasion toward the English coast. So England faced two great invasions at once, one from the north and one from the south, and had no way of knowing which would arrive first. It was Hardrada who struck first. In the late summer of 1066, he sailed with a great fleet and a formidable army, landed in the north, and won a hard-fought victory over the local English forces at Fulford, just outside York. The city opened its gates to him. It must have looked, to anyone standing on those walls, as though the days of the great heathen army had come round again, and that another mighty Norse king was about to carve himself a kingdom out of England, exactly as his predecessors had. But Harald Godwinson reacted with astonishing speed. He gathered his army and marched it north at a pace that still impresses people who study such things, covering the long road from the south of England in a matter of days. And he came down on the Norwegians when they were least expecting anybody at all, at a crossing called Stamford Bridge. How he moved so fast is still debated, whether he took mounted men and left the foot soldiers strung out behind him, or whether the old chroniclers simply admired the feat into something faster than it was. They were caught entirely unprepared, so confident after their victory, and so warm in an unseasonable September sun, that a great many of them had left their heavy mail back with the ships, and were resting at their ease, waiting for hostages to be delivered, when the dust of an approaching army rose on the road and resolved itself into the entire English host. What followed was short and decisive. In the fighting at the crossing, an arrow found the last great Viking king at the throat, and he fell. Tostig fell too, and the great Norwegian army was cut to pieces so thoroughly that of the enormous fleet which had come to conquer England, only a small remnant of ships was needed to carry the survivors home. There is a grim and famous exchange remembered from just before the battle. Harald Godwinson, it is said, rode out and offered his estranged brother peace and a share of the kingdom, and when Tostig asked what the Norwegian king would be given, the English king answered that he would give him 7 feet of English ground, or a little more, since he was said to be taller than most men. It was all the land in England Harald Hardrada ever won. Stamford Bridge was a total and crushing English victory, and it is traditionally taken to mark the very end of the Viking Age. The last time a great Norse king came to take an English throne by the sword and was thrown back into the sea. The age that opened with strange ships appearing off a small holy island closed with a Norse king dead on an English field, killed by an English army defending a united kingdom that had grown up precisely because of men like him. In that sense, the story came round to a fitting close. And yet, in one of history's great cruelties, that magnificent victory became the seed of the victor's ruin. No sooner had Harald destroyed the threat in the north than word came that the other invader had landed in the south. His army, bloodied and exhausted from a savage fight and a punishing march, had to turn about and race the whole length of England again. 19 days after his triumph, he met Duke William at Hastings, and there, worn down and outmanoeuvred, the English king was defeated and killed, and England passed to the Normans. 2 invasions in a single autumn had between them destroyed the old English kingdom. Hardrada was in many ways the perfect man to stand at the closing of the age, because he carried both its glory and its restlessness in one person. The fortune he had gathered in the emperor's service was so vast that it had to be moved home quietly, and with it he made himself the wealthiest ruler in the north. He was a builder as well as a fighter, and the trading town he planted on a sheltered fjord in the south of Norway would grow, in the fullness of time, into Oslo, though archaeologists poking about beneath the modern city keep finding evidence that people were already living there before he arrived, and are politely skeptical about the whole founding story. The sagas preserve one fine detail about his last morning. Whether or not it is strictly true, it is said that as the fight began to turn against him, Harald composed a verse of poetry on the spot, decided it was not good enough, and immediately composed a better one. Even at the edge of death, a great man of the north was expected to meet what came with a well-turned line and an unmoved face. He fought on foot in the thick of the press until the arrow found him, and with him died not only a king, but an entire way of being in the world. The wandering warrior who won treasure in far countries and kingdoms with his own hand and went out with a poem on his lips. Rest now, with the last great northern king fallen at a river crossing and the whole shape of history turning on a few short weeks of one fateful autumn. Here is the deepest irony in the whole story. The men who conquered England that year, the Normans under Duke William, were themselves Vikings in origin. The very word Norman is simply Northmen, worn smooth by French mouths, and the people of Normandy were descended from Norse raiders who had settled at the mouth of the Seine more than a century and a half earlier. So the final blow that ended Anglo-Saxon England was struck not by the English against the Norse, but by one branch of the Norse against the kingdom that had beaten all the others. A last echo of the Viking Age delivered by the grandchildren of Vikings who no longer thought of themselves that way at all. To understand how that happened, look at what became of the Norse wherever they settled, because their most lasting mark on the world was not made by raiding, it was made by blending in. Normandy is the clearest case. Generations earlier, a band of raiders under a chieftain the Franks called Rollo had seized a stretch of land around the lower Seine and simply could not be dislodged. Rather than fight an endless and unwinnable war, the Frankish king struck a bargain, granting Rollo and his followers the land they were already sitting on in exchange for their loyalty, their defence of that coast against other raiders, and their acceptance of Christianity. The Norsemen took the deal. And over the following generations, something remarkable happened to them. They adopted the French language, the Christian faith, the local customs, the local law. They married into the population around them. Within a few generations, these Northmen had become the Normans, French-speaking Christian lords with castles and cavalry, and their duchy grew into one of the most dynamic and frankly aggressive powers in Europe. Its restless energy, perhaps some lingering inheritance from the old grandfathers, carrying them to conquests in England, in southern Italy, in Sicily, and further still. What they kept of the north was surprisingly little, and mostly buried in words. A scatter of village names along the Norman coast that end in old Scandinavian elements for a farm or a homestead. A handful of sea terms still used by fishermen there, and the name of the duchy itself, which never stopped announcing where its lords had come from, even after not one of them could have understood a word of the old tongue. The same pattern played out everywhere the Norse settled among other peoples. In the east, as we have seen, the Rus who had come as a ruling elite gradually dissolved into the far more numerous Slavic population they governed, taking up its language and its ways until their northern origins survived only as a memory in old chronicles, and out of that blending came the beginnings of a great state. In Ireland, the Norse who had founded Dublin and the other coastal towns married into Irish families, took up much of Irish life, and were slowly absorbed, leaving behind their harbours and their trade as the lasting gift. Everywhere it was the same. They arrived as something separate and frightening, and within 3 or 4 generations they had become part of the furniture. In Scotland, in the Isle of Man, along the coasts and in parts of Wales, Norse settlers mingled with the people already there across the generations, leaving behind their blood, their place names and countless words, and ceasing in time to be anything apart. In a few of the northern islands, the old speech held on remarkably long, a Norse tongue still being spoken in Orkney and Shetland into the 18th century, long after everyone had forgotten where it came from, before it too faded into the local English. Even in England itself, where the settlers of the Danelaw had come so thickly, the same quiet absorption took place. The Danish and Norwegian families who had come to farm the north and east were woven, generation by generation, into the fabric of English life. Their speech blended into the English language and enriched it enormously. Their law and their customs mixed with English ones. So completely did they merge that by the time the Normans landed, the descendants of those settlers were counted simply as English, standing in the shield wall against a new set of invaders. The sharp line Alfred had been forced to draw across the middle of the country had blurred and then dissolved into a single people. This capacity to settle down and become part of the very peoples they had once raided is, in the long run, perhaps the most important thing about them. More important than the raids, more important even than the voyages. They were not only destroyers. Everywhere they went, they eventually put down roots, and in putting down roots, they enriched and reshaped whatever they had entered. The Norse contribution to English alone is enormous. A great crowd of everyday words so ordinary now that nobody hears anything foreign in them at all. They founded cities that are thriving still. They mingled their blood so widely that their descendants across northern Europe and beyond are past all counting. So the Vikings did not so much disappear as dissolve. They spread themselves so thoroughly into the peoples around them that they stopped existing as a separate thing, precisely because they had become part of everything. The Normans in France and England, the Rus in the east, the Norse Irish of Dublin, the farmers of the Danelaw, all of them began as Northmen and ended as something new, carrying an inheritance forward under other names. That restless energy did not spend itself in England either. In the very same century, a band of Norman adventurers, younger sons looking for a fortune far from home in the oldest tradition there is, made their way down to southern Italy and carved out lands there by force and cunning, until in time they had taken the whole Italian south and the great island of Sicily and founded a rich and brilliant kingdom of their own beneath the Mediterranean sun. From there, the same drive carried on into the expeditions to the Holy Land, where Norman lords won principalities in the east, so that the descendants of northern raiders left their mark from the cold grey water of the North Sea to the deserts of the Levant. And here and there, tucked into odd corners of the map, small living relics outlasted the age that made them. On one island in the Irish Sea, settled long ago by Norsemen, there survives to this day an open-air assembly of the people, a direct descendant of the old Things, which has met and made law in an unbroken line for more than 1,000 years, and has a fair claim to be the oldest continuous parliament anywhere in the world. It is a quiet marvel that in this one place, the old northern practice of free men gathering in the open air to govern themselves never died at all, but simply flowed on down the centuries, and carried a living fragment of the Viking Age into the present morning. Rest now, with the Northmen quietly becoming Normans and Russians and Englishmen, and the sharp edges of the raiding age softening into the ordinary life of a new Europe. Which leaves the last question of our long journey. Why did it end at all? For nearly 3 centuries, the Norse had raided and traded and explored and conquered across a great sweep of the world. And then, over the course of a few generations, the whole thing wound down and passed into history. There was no single cause, no one battle, no one year that switched it off. Rather, the many conditions that had made such an age possible all changed at once, and as they changed, the tide of expansion slowly ebbed until the beach was dry. It is worth gathering up those reasons at the end, because in understanding why the age closed, we understand what it had been all along. Much of the change came from inside the Norse world itself. The rise of strong kings and organised kingdoms in Denmark and Norway and Sweden meant that energy which had once poured out in freelance raiding was now gathered up and controlled by rulers who wanted order at home, and who took a dim view of independent warriors sailing off on their own account, with their own ships and their own ideas. The coming of Christianity worked in exactly the same direction, softening the old code of honour and plunder, teaching that raiding fellow Christians was a sin, drawing the North into the shared moral world of Christian Europe. As the homelands filled with churches and settled into kingdoms, the young man who might once have gone Viking for silver and a name found that road quietly closing. In its place stood service to a king, or work in one of the growing towns, or the ordinary life of a Christian farmer with a plough and a set of obligations. The wider world had changed as well, and more to the point, it had learned. The kingdoms that once lay open and undefended before a northern fleet were open no longer. Alfred and his heirs had demonstrated what a well-organised kingdom could do with fortified towns and standing defences and ships of its own, and others across Europe had absorbed the same hard lesson. Coasts were watched now, river mouths were fortified, bridges were built low across the water deliberately to stop a shallow hull from slipping upstream in the dark. The divided, defenceless targets of the early years had given way to stronger, more united realms that could hit back and hit back hard. The easy plunder was simply gone. Raiding a well-defended Christian kingdom had become a dangerous and frequently unprofitable line of work, and the money was drying up too. That great flow of Eastern silver which had helped fund the whole enterprise dwindled as the mines of the Islamic world gave out, and the coins stopped coming north in the old quantities. The engine that had driven so much of the age was running down, and some historians think this quiet economic fact did more to end the Viking Age than any battle ever did. So it closed, not with a last great clash, but with a slow fading. The raiders became kings and farmers and merchants. The heathen north became Christian. The open world shut its coasts, and the distinctive way of living that had defined 3 centuries dissolved into the ordinary history of medieval Europe. By the later 11th century and afterward, the Scandinavians were simply the peoples of 3 Christian kingdoms among all the other kingdoms of the continent. Not a terror on the water anymore. Neighbours, trading partners, fellow Christians. The wild moment had passed, but look at what it left behind. They had permanently reshaped the map of Europe, founding or growing cities from Dublin to Kyiv, planting peoples and place names and words across a vast region, seeding the ruling houses of Normandy and England and Russia with their blood. They had settled Iceland and given the world the sagas, that incomparable treasure of memory, without which this entire age would be nearly a blank to us. They had reached Greenland and touched the shores of North America centuries before anyone else came out of Europe, which stands among the great feats of exploration in all of human history. And they had carried goods and silver and ideas across a quarter of the world, knitting together lands that had never before had any connection at all, from the markets of Baghdad to a farmhouse at the head of a Norwegian fjord. Their inheritance runs on in a way no chronicle ever recorded. The modern study of deep ancestry across Britain and Ireland and much of Northern Europe keeps turning up the quiet contribution of those Norse settlers, present in millions of people who have never given the Vikings a moment's thought. The men and women who crossed the cold seas in those wooden hulls left descendants past all counting, so that a great share of the modern North carries some small thread of this age inside it. A living legacy, older and wider than any carved stone. And they left something less tangible that has never quite let the world go, the image of them. The longships and the fearless crossings, the gods and the sagas, the sheer nerve of a people who put out in open boats across unknown water. Some of that picture is invention, as we have seen, the horns and the mindless savagery painted on by later imaginations. But underneath the invention sits something genuinely extraordinary, a people from a poor and frozen corner of the world who for 300 years threw themselves outward across the oceans with a daring that changed history, and who then sat down and became the ancestors of half of modern Europe. Even their open-air assemblies and their stubborn love of their own freedom have tempted some to trace a faint thread forward toward later ideas of self-government, though that is a long and uncertain line to draw. Some of what they left is so deep in daily life that we use it without noticing. Consider the days of the week, which in English still carry the old northern gods on their backs. Tuesday belongs to a war god, Wednesday to Odin under his older name, Thursday to the thunder god with his hammer, Friday to a goddess of the household. Every week, without meaning to, we recite a little of a religion nobody has practiced for 1,000 years, its gods surviving in the plainest words we have, long after the last temple fell silent. And beyond the calendar, there is a great crowd of ordinary English words, words as common as sky and knife and egg, law and husband and window, which came into the language from the tongue of the Norse settlers, and now feel like the oldest English of all. Even the way we picture them owes nearly as much to later centuries as to the age itself. Long after the North had become peaceful Christian nations, a great wave of romantic fascination swept over their memory, as poets and painters and composers rediscovered the sagas and the gods and refashioned the raiders into figures of high drama. Much of what the modern world imagines when it hears the word Viking was shaped in that later enthusiasm, a mixture of real history and grand invention. The living Norse would scarcely recognize some of the pictures that now bear their name, but beneath all the costume, the real achievement remains, and it needs no exaggeration whatever to astonish us. In the end, this is a story of transformation. A wild and expansive moment rose out of the northern seas, blazed across the world for 3 centuries, and then settled quietly down into the foundations of the Europe we know. The men who frightened the monks on that small tidal island became in time the Christian kings and the law-abiding farmers and the city-dwelling merchants of ordinary medieval life. Their descendants scattered so widely that no one can count them. The age ended, but its people never really went anywhere. They simply became part of everyone who came after. And that, perhaps, is the truest ending of all. Not a death, a dissolving. The great northern adventure pouring itself out into the long, ongoing story of the world. So the rise and fall of the Viking Age, from a beach in the northern mist to the founding of nations, has run its course, and our long journey through it is done. If you are somehow still awake after all of that, I am glad you stayed with me to the end. There is another quiet story waiting for you on the screen, if you would like to keep drifting along together a little while longer. And if this one gave you any comfort tonight, it would mean a great deal if you would take a slow moment to like and subscribe, or to leave a passing thought in the comments before you go. But there is nothing left for you to do now, nothing at all. Let your body grow heavy and still. Let your shoulders sink. Let your breathing settle into something slow and easy and unhurried, the way the sea moves when the wind has finally gone out of it. Somewhere far away on a green shelf of land beside cold water, A fire is burning low in the middle of a long, turf-roofed hall. The animals are quiet. The smoke is drifting up through the roof and out into the dark. And down on the shingle, a little wooden ship lies waiting, with the tide creeping up around it, its carved prow turned out toward open water, in no hurry to go anywhere at all. Let it push off gently now, without you. Let it slide out past the last headland, sail full, oars still, growing smaller and quieter, until it is only a mark on the far edge of the water, and then not even that. The longships have sailed, the halls have gone quiet, the story is finished, and you are safe and warm, and nothing more is asked of you tonight. Close your eyes, go to sleep.